Hey there, and welcome back. If you have found your way here at the end of a long day, lights down, the room gone still around you, then you are exactly where this story wants you to be. There is a kind of tiredness that comes not from doing too much, but from carrying too much. And on nights like that, the mind does not want a lecture or a list of dates. It wants to be taken somewhere. Tonight, it is going somewhere a long way off, across nearly 9 centuries, into the life of a woman who was born to rule 3 kingdoms and was never, in the end, crowned in the one she wanted most. The cold of a Norman keep before dawn, when the stone holds the chill of the winter in it. The press of a coronation crowd in the great nave at Mainz, incense thick in the air, a language she could not yet understand rolling over her head. The smell of tallow and wet wool and horses in a war camp, the white of fresh snow on a frozen river at midnight, and a handful of figures moving across it in the dark, wrapped head to foot in white, so the watching sentries would not catch them against the snow. All of that belonged to one life. We are going to walk through it together, from the first hour to the last. Before we go in, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. What city? What country? What hour it has reached where you are? If you feel like telling me, leave it below. I do read them, and there is something I like about the thought of all these different rooms, all these different times of night, settling into the same far-off story at once. And if these long, quiet evenings are something you would like to find your way back to, you are always welcome to subscribe, so that the next one can find you when it is ready. That is all of that for the night. Her name was Matilda. She was the daughter of one king of England and the mother of another. She was Holy Roman Empress before she was 25, and she kept that title, with a fierce and stubborn pride, for the rest of her life. She was named heir to the throne of England by her own father, and the greatest men of the realm swore on holy relics to accept her. And when the moment came, they broke that oath and put a man on the throne instead. And she gave the best years of her life to taking back what had been promised her. She came within a few weeks, within the ringing of a single set of bells, of being crowned Queen of England in her own right, the first woman ever to hold that crown. And then it slipped from her hands, in London, in one disastrous summer. Tonight, you are going to live that life with her, the strange arc of it. And you will see that the woman history flattened into a single hard word was something far larger and far braver than the word allows. I want to give you a sense of the world she opened her eyes in, because almost everything she became was shaped by where she began. She was born around the year 1102, most likely in February, probably at Winchester or in one of the royal houses near it, Winchester, the old capital of the Anglo-Saxon kings, where the treasury was kept and the dead kings lay in the great church, and the weight of English royalty seemed to gather in the cold light off the chalk hills. Imagine the room she came into, a chamber in a royal residence in the dead of an English winter, the walls hung with worked cloth to keep out the draughts, a fire burning low in the night. The women of her mother's household gathered close around the bed in the dim, their breath visible in the cold air away from the hearth. Outside, the short grey days, the bare trees, the river running hard and brown with winter rain. This was the England she was born into, a country only 30-some years out from a conquest that had remade it top to bottom, still raw with it, still ruled by the iron hand of the family that had taken it. Her father was Henry I of England, the youngest and the cleverest of the sons of William the Conqueror, the Norman Duke who had crossed the narrow sea in 1066, won England in a single day's battle near Hastings, and stamped his rule onto the country, with castles and surveys and a ferocity that was still, 2 generations on, the foundation of everything. Henry was never meant to be king. He had older brothers ahead of him, but the eldest died, and the next, William called Rufus, was killed by an arrow in the New Forest in the year 1100, in a death that has never been fully explained and that some have always quietly suspected. Henry happened to be hunting in that same forest on that very day. He did not stop to mourn. By nightfall he had ridden hard to Winchester and laid hands on the royal treasury, the silver that was the sinew of power. And within 3 days he had himself crowned at Westminster before any rival could gather breath. This was the father into whose house Matilda was born, a man who had taken a throne in 72 hours by being faster, cleverer, and more ruthless than anyone around him, and who then held it for 35 years by never once relaxing his grip. Her mother gave the child something her father, for all his power, could not. Henry had married, deliberately and with great care, a woman named Edith, daughter of Malcolm, King of Scots and of Margaret, a princess of the ancient royal house of England, the line of Alfred the Great, the line the Normans had displaced by the sword. Edith took the name Matilda at her marriage and gave that name in turn to her daughter. So in the veins of the little girl born at Winchester ran 2 bloods that had been at war within living memory. The blood of the conquerors through her father, and the blood of the conquered, the old English kings, through her mother. She was, in the deepest sense, the age understood, the joining of the 2 Englands in a single child, the conqueror for a grandfather on one side, Alfred's line standing behind her on the other. Hold that in mind, because it is the reason that, decades later, men would speak of her cause as the rightful one, even as it was losing. She was not merely one claimant among several. She was the knot in which the broken halves of England were tied back together, and everyone who looked at her knew it. And there was a third thing her mother gave her, harder to name, but plainer in its consequences than any drop of royal blood. The elder Matilda was a queen who governed. She was no mere ornament at her husband's side. When King Henry crossed to Normandy on the business of the duchy, it was often his wife who held England in his absence, who sat in judgment, who put her seal to the writs that kept the machinery of the realm turning. She had been raised herself in part among nuns, and was famously pious and learned, founding hospitals, patronizing scholars, washing the feet of the poor in the old royal manner. A daughter growing up in the household of such a mother absorbed, without ever being formally taught it, a particular idea of what a royal woman was for, that she was a person with her own authority and her own work, and not only a vessel for carrying a man's line forward. The elder Matilda died when her daughter was still a small child, too young to have learned it all at her knee. But the pattern of it was set in the household, in the women who had served her, in the simple lived fact that the realm had more than once been governed by a queen. The daughter would spend her whole life acting on a belief her mother had embodied, that a woman could hold power in her own hands. The household she was raised in did not sit still. The Anglo-Norman court was perpetually in motion, and a royal child of this period had no single nursery in a single quiet home. She had a moving world. The court travelled between England and Normandy, back and forth across the cold grey water of the Channel, and within each country it moved from residence to residence, Winchester, Westminster, Woodstock with its hunting park, the great Norman castles at Rouen and Caen and Falaise, eating its way through the stored food of one estate and then riding on to the next before the larders gave out. So her earliest years were a procession of carts and baggage trains and armed escorts on muddy roads, of halls that were home for a week and then left behind, of servants packing and unpacking the same chests in one cold stone chamber after another. And through it all moved her father, appearing and vanishing according to the endless demands of governing 2 countries at once, a remote and formidable presence who held the turning machine of the realm together by the force of his own will. There is a particular quality to a childhood spent always in motion, and it leaves its mark. A child of the travelling court learned that home was not a place, but a household, the same faces, the same chests, the same routines, set down in one stone hall and then taken up and carried to the next. Permanence lived in people and in objects, not in walls. Such a child learned to be at ease anywhere and rooted nowhere, to carry her sense of who she was inside herself, because the outside was forever changing. For most royal children, this was simply the texture of life, unremarkable because universal. For Matilda, it became something more, almost a preparation, though no one could have meant it so. She would spend her whole life being carried or carrying herself from one country to another. England, Germany, Italy, Anjou, England. Again, Normandy, never settling for long. At home, fully in no single realm. The rootlessness that began as the ordinary condition of a royal nursery became the shape of her entire existence. She was a woman of everywhere and nowhere. An empress the English thought foreign, and an Englishwoman the empire had made its own. And the first lessons in that life of motion were learned before she could have known she was learning anything at all. She had a younger brother, William, born a year or so after her, and he, not she, was the precious one, the heir, the boy, the single life on whom the entire future of the dynasty was understood to rest. That was simply the order of things, and a girl raised inside it absorbed it without needing to be told. A son carried the line, a daughter was a daughter, and a daughter's purpose in a royal house was to be given away in marriage to seal an alliance somewhere far off. Matilda would have grown up, knowing this about herself, the way a child knows the weather, that one day she would be sent. She did not yet know where, or when, or how completely, but the knowledge was there from the beginning, woven into the moving, provisional, watchful world of the travelling court. And when the summons came, it came even so. Sooner, and from farther away than anyone in that household could have guessed. A girl in such a household learned early what she was and was not. She was a daughter of the king, dressed and fed, and attended according to her rank, taught her letters and her prayers and her manners, valued, but valued in a particular way, as a resource of future use, rather than a future ruler. The attention, the hope, the careful planning, all flowed toward her brother, the boy, the heir. She was the alliance waiting to be made, the marriage waiting to be spent, and there is no sign she resented it as a child, because children absorb the shape of their world as simply the way things are. It would only be much later, after she had ruled an empire and been told she could not rule the kingdom of her birth, that the old arrangement would come to seem an injustice rather than a fact of nature. But the early lesson was laid down, all the same, deep and quiet, that a woman's place in the order of things was settled and subordinate. That power ran through sons. She would spend the back half of her life proving that lesson wrong by main force, and perhaps some part of the iron in her came from how early and how completely she had first been taught it, that somewhere arrived sooner than anyone might have expected, and it was as far away and as exalted as a royal daughter's marriage could reach. When Matilda was about 7, her father concluded the most prestigious match of his whole reign. His small daughter was to be married to Henry V, King of Germany and King of the Romans, the man who held, or who was about to hold, the title of Holy Roman Emperor, the most exalted secular dignity in all of Western Christendom, the heir to the very idea of Rome itself. For the daughter of a Norman king whose own grandfather had been merely a duke, this was a staggering elevation. It meant the King of England had married his blood into the imperial house, the summit of the Christian world. It also meant the King of England had to pay for the privilege, and the price was enormous. A vast dowry of silver, raised by a heavy and bitterly resented tax, laid across all of England, so that in a sense the ploughmen and the townsfolk of her father's kingdom bought the little girl her crown without ever seeing her face. And it meant that Matilda, at the age of about 8, would leave her family, her country, her language, and everything she had ever known, and travel into the heart of the empire to be raised there as its future empress. That is where we are going next. It is hard, from this distance, to feel the full weight of what such a match meant, so let one comparison stand for it. The Holy Roman Emperor was not merely one king among the kings of Europe. He was held, in theory at least, to be the first among them all, the secular counterpart of the Pope, the heir to the authority of ancient Rome itself, the man whose office sat at the very apex of the Christian political order. For the king of distant England, an island kingdom won by conquest within living memory, ruled by a family whose grandfather had been a duke. To place his daughter in that imperial bed was to reach as high as it was possible for a Western ruler to reach. It announced to all of Europe that the Norman House of England had arrived among the very greatest, that its blood was fit to mingle with the imperial line. No wonder the old king strained his kingdom's resources to pay for it. The prestige was worth almost any price. And no wonder, too, that Matilda carried the dignity of it in her bones for the rest of her life. She had not merely married well, she had married into the single most exalted office the Western world possessed, and been crowned within it, and governed in its name. England, when it later asked her to be grateful for the mere prospect of its crown, never quite grasped that it was offering a lesser thing to a woman who had already held the greater. And there is a quiet symmetry worth noticing across the whole shape of her life between the two great journeys that bracketed it. As a child of 8, she was carried east, across the sea and over the rivers into the empire, to be made into something for her father's purposes. As a woman past 40, she was carried back west, over the same sea, for the last time into Normandy, to spend her final years near where her family's greatness had begun. Between those two crossings lay everything: the crown near Rome, the widowhood, the recall, the second marriage, the sons, the broken oath, the war, the near coronation, the flight through the snow. She had gone out a piece to be moved and come back, at the last. A power in her own right, who moved pieces of her own. The girl delivered into the empire, and the old woman ordering her son's affairs from Rouen were the same person. And the distance between them is the measure of a life lived at the very centre of the great events of an age. Few women of any century travelled so far, in every sense, from where they began. In February of the year 1110, the child left England, and she would not set eyes on it again for 16 years. Picture the departure, because it is the first of the great partings of her life. The Channel crossing in deep winter, in the small, high-prowed wooden ships of the age, no shelter to speak of, the grey swell heaving under a low grey sky, the cold spray coming over the side and soaking through wool and fur, the seasickness that spared no one, not the great lords and not the 8-year-old girl who was the reason for the whole voyage. Around her moved the household that had been assembled to deliver her, the women who would tend her hair and her clothes, the clerks and chaplains, the officials carrying the sealed documents of her marriage and guarding the heavy chests that held part of that ruinous dowry. And somewhere in the mind of a girl too young to truly grasp, it must have sat the plain fact that the faces seeing her off from the English shore were the last English faces she would see for a very long time. She was sailing out of her childhood. She did not yet know it, but she would come back a stranger to her own country. We should not pass too quickly over what such a journey was, because it was the great rupture of her childhood, and it set the pattern of every parting that came after. A medieval royal progress across half of Europe in winter was not a matter of days but of weeks. Over the cold sea first, then up through the Low Countries and into the German lands by river barge and by horse and by cart, the whole cumbersome household creeping along the frozen roads, halting each night at an abbey or a bishop's hall or a castle whose lord was bound to feed and shelter them. For the child at the centre of it, every halt meant new faces, new walls, a new cold chamber, and the steady erosion of everything familiar. The women who had dressed her in England would be sent home. The food would change, then the prayers, then the very sounds in the corridor at night. By the time she reached the heart of the empire, there would have been almost nothing left of England around her but herself. That, in truth, was the point of the whole exercise. She was being delivered, like the chests of silver that travelled with her, into a new world that meant to keep her and remake her. And the cold journey was the passage between the child she had been and the empress she was being sent to become. They carried her up the rivers and the roads of the empire, through Liege and onward into Germany, to be presented to the man she was to marry. Henry V was in his 20s, more than twice her age, a hard, driving, capable ruler who had deposed his own father to seize the throne, and who was locked in a bitter, grinding struggle with the papacy over a single burning question: who had the right to appoint the bishops of the church, the king or the pope? History calls that quarrel the investiture controversy, and it consumed his reign. He did not need, in 1110, a wife who could rule beside him. She was a child of 8. What he needed was the English alliance, the mountain of silver that came with her, and the lasting prospect of an empress raised inside his own lands, formed by his own court, speaking his own tongue, belonging body and soul to the empire rather than to England. So the marriage was not made fully for years. Instead, the little girl was simply handed over, like the silver, to be educated and transformed and made German. Consider what was being asked of her and of her father in plain human terms beneath the grand diplomacy. A man was handing over his small daughter, perhaps 8 years old, to be raised by strangers in a far country, knowing he might never see her again, and in fact he would not, for many years, and her mother would be dead before any reunion was possible. And a little girl was being given to a man more than twice her age, in a land whose language she did not speak, to be kept and shaped until she was old enough to be his wife in full. We should not soften this with the knowledge that it was normal for the age. It was normal, and it was also, by any human measure, a hard thing to do to a child, and the children it was done to felt it as children feel things, without the consolations of statecraft. Whatever Matilda became, and she became formidable. She began as a small girl handed across a continent to strangers, and something of that early severance, that early lesson, that affection bowed to dynasty, and that she herself was a piece to be moved, surely stayed with her. It would help explain the armour she wore ever after, and the fierce hold she kept, all her life, on the one dignity that had been given to her in exchange the title of Empress, which no one could take back, and which she would not let go. They betrothed the pair at Utrecht at Easter, and not long after, in the cathedral city of Mainz on the Rhine, the child was crowned. Try to stand in that day with her. A vast foreign cathedral, stones soaring up into shadow, cold even with the crowd packed into it, the air heavy and blue with incense, the deep, rolling sound of chanting in Latin, and the murmur of a language she was only just beginning to catch the edges of. Ranks of German princes and bishops in their stiff, heavy robes and their furs. Every eye in that enormous space fixed on one undersized girl from across the sea, who could not yet have understood more than a stray word of the solemn things being said over her. And then the weight of a crown, real metal, lowered onto a head far too young to carry it from that hour. She was, in title and in law, Queen of the Romans, and in time would be Empress. She was perhaps 8 years old. Whatever was left of her childhood ended there, in that incense and that cold and that thunder of foreign Latin. She was now the bearer of a destiny far larger than herself, and the men and women around her set briskly about the work of preparing her to fill it. The Mainz she was crowned in was one of the great cities of the empire, an archbishop's seat on the Rhine whose cathedral was among the most important churches north of the Alps. For a girl raised so far, it must have seemed the centre of the world, the broad grey river crowded with barges and trade, the steep streets, the looming weight of the cathedral, the constant coming and going of princes and prelates, and the armed men who attended them. This was now her world, and the German court that closed around her was a school as much as a household. She was given over to tutors and to noblewomen who would teach her everything an empress had to know, and the curriculum was not gentle. She learned the language fast, as children do, until it became the language she thought in. She learned the deep and prickly etiquette of an imperial court where a misjudged precedence could insult a duke. She learned to sit through ceremonies of crushing length without fidgeting, to hold her face still under the eyes of a hall full of strangers, to be looked at and judged, and to give nothing away. By the time she was 12, she had been so thoroughly remade that an Englishman of her father's court, meeting her, would have found a German princess where a Norman child had been sent. The remaking was complete, and it was permanent. Some part of her would be German for the rest of her life. What followed were the years that quietly made her into the woman she would be, though no chronicler thought them worth describing in detail, because they were only the education of a girl. From about the age of 8 to the age of about 12, Matilda was kept somewhat apart and given over to German tutors and to the household charged with turning her into an empress. She learned the language until it was no longer foreign, but her own, until she thought and dreamed in it. She learned the customs of the imperial court, the exact and jealous order of precedence, the rituals of coronation and audience, the deep and tangled lore and lore of the strange ancient office she had married into. For the empire was nothing like her father's compact, hard-governed island kingdom. It was a vast, loose, sprawling assembly of duchies and counties and bishoprics and proud free cities, reaching from the cold North Sea coast down across the Alps and deep into Italy, held together not by tidy administration, but by the towering idea of the imperial crown and by the personal force of whoever wore it. To be empress of such a realm was to be the living consort of an idea as much as of a man. The girl from Winchester was being shaped, year by quiet year, to carry that idea, and by every sign that survives she learned it thoroughly, and learned it well. When she was about 12, in the year 1114, the marriage was at last solemnized in full, and she began to live as Henry's true wife, and as a working empress. And here something becomes visible that matters for the entire rest of her life. She was good at it. The role of empress was not an ornament in her hands. She acted as her husband's regent when he was away. She held court in her own person. She heard the pleas of suppliants and pronounced judgment on them. When Henry went down over the Alps into Italy to press his quarrels and pursue his coronation by the Pope, he left her behind, more than once, as his representative with real and substantial authority, and she discharged it capably enough that the foremost men of the empire treated her not as the king's young wife to be humoured, but as a genuine wellspring of power to be reckoned with. There survive records of her presiding over cases, intervening, deciding, being obeyed. In those years she learned the actual daily practice of rule, not the theory of it from a book, not the ornament of it at a feast, but the real exercise of authority over hard and watchful men who were waiting to see whether she could hold what she had been handed. She held it, and the deepest lesson of her whole life was written into her in those German years, that a woman could govern. Not in theory, she knew it because she had done it, and done it well, and been obeyed. And the knowledge never left her, through every later year, when men told her to her face that the thing she had already done was impossible. Try to imagine the texture of those working days, because they are the days that built the woman. The imperial court did not sit in one fixed palace any more than her father's did. It moved through the cities and the bishop's seats of Germany, and wherever it came to rest, the business of an empire came with it. There were the formal audiences in halls hung with worked cloth, the petitioners kneeling on cold stone, the clerks at their sloped desks scratching out charters in Latin by the light of high windows. There were the embassies to receive, Men come from Rome, or from the Italian cities, or from the proud bishops of the Rhineland, each to be heard and weighed and answered in the right words and the right order. For a wrong word in such a setting could harden into a feud that lasted years. There were the disputes between great men to be judged, the grants of land to be confirmed under the seal, the endless careful management of pride and precedence that was the true daily work of ruling. And presiding over a good deal of it, in her husband's absence, was a young woman not yet out of her teens, who had been a frightened child on a winter ship only a few years before, and who had learned to hold a hall full of hard men in their places by the steadiness of her own bearing. She was learning, in those years, the one craft that would never leave her, the craft of being obeyed. And in all this, she was still, by the count of years, extraordinarily young a teenager, doing the work of a seasoned regent, a girl barely into womanhood, holding her own among the grey-bearded magnates of the empire. It is easy to forget how young she was through the most formative part of her life, because she carried herself with such weight that the chroniclers wrote of her as though she had always been the formidable figure of her later years. But the Empress, who governed in her husband's absence, was younger than many a modern student, and the poise it took to do that, in that world, among those men, was remarkable by any measure. She did not have the luxury of a long sheltered youth. She was made to be a ruler before she was fully grown, and being made so early and so hard, the mould set and never afterwards softened. The woman England would later find so difficult to deal with had been forged in the imperial court before she was 20, and you cannot unforge such a making. By the time she set foot in England as her father's heir, she had been a great lady and a wielder of real power for longer than many of her future critics had been adults. They saw a difficult woman. They were looking at the finished work of the hardest apprenticeship in Christendom, and there was the matter of being looked at, always, which is its own kind of education. An empress was never private in the way ordinary people are private. She was watched in the hall, watched at the table, watched at her prayers, watched for any sign of weakness or favour or fear that the men around her might use. To live like that from childhood is to develop a particular armour, a stillness of face, a control of the voice, a habit of giving away nothing that has not been decided in advance to be given. Matilda developed it thoroughly, and it served her all her life, and it is very likely part of what the English chroniclers later mistook for coldness and pride. They saw a woman who did not flatter, did not plead, did not soften herself to win them, and they called it arrogance. What they were seeing was the armour of someone who had been a public figure since the age of 8, who had learned in a hard school that to show need was to invite predation, and who had governed real men in a real court before most of her English critics were grown. The manner that lost her friends in England was the manner that had let her hold power in Germany. She did not know how to put it off, and perhaps by then there was nothing underneath it to put off. The armour had become the woman. In the year 1117, they went down together over the mountains into Italy, and there came the moment that she would treasure above every other, the memory she would hold to for 50 years afterward. Henry was crowned in the grand imperial manner connected with Rome itself, the eternal city, the seat of the old empire whose fallen mantle the German rulers claimed to wear, and Matilda was crowned with him. To be raised up in the imperial style, in or in association with Rome, was the highest secular dignity a human being could hold in the Western world. There was nothing above it but the Pope and God. She was perhaps 15 years old, a girl from a wet island at the edge of Christendom, standing near the centre of it all in cloth of gold. From that point, she was the Empress in the fullest and proudest sense the word could carry. And she would call herself Empress, and require others to call her Empress, for the remaining 50 years of her life, long after the empire had nothing further to do with her at all. It was not mere vanity, or not only vanity. It was the memory of having stood once at the very summit of the Christian world. Nothing England would ever afterward offer her could match the height of that day in Italy, and she never let a living soul forget what she had been. Before Italy there had been Germany, and the years of learning to rule it, and these deserve their due because they are where she first tasted real authority. The empire her husband governed was perpetually restless, its great dukes jealous of their independence, its bishops caught between emperor and pope, its Italian cities forever slipping the imperial leash. To hold such a realm together took ceaseless effort, and the emperor could not be everywhere. So he used his wife, young as she was sent to represent him, to preside, to keep the imperial presence felt in places he could not reach. We have glimpses of her in the records doing exactly this, hearing causes, issuing documents, acting with delegated power, and being obeyed by men who could have made her life difficult had they chosen to test a girl. They did not, on the whole, test her, which tells us something. She had the bearing for it, the trained stillness and the confidence of her blood and her office, and she carried authority in a way that did not invite challenge. By the time she came back to England, she had years of this behind her, not the theory of rule from a tutor's book, but the thing itself, done in the hardest school in Europe. It was the great hidden asset of her life, and the great tragedy of it was that the country she came home to could not see the asset for the woman who carried it. The crossing of the Alps was itself an ordeal that few who have not done it can picture the steep climb up through the passes, the air thinning, the cold deepening with every mile of ascent, the narrow tracks where a baggage mule could step wrong and be gone over the edge into the white silence below. An imperial expedition into Italy was a small army on the move, hundreds of horses and carts and men, weeks of hard travel before the land opened out at last into the plains of Lombardy. And waiting at the end of it was Italy, which to a girl raised in the grey north must have seemed another world entirely. The heat, the light, the ancient stone cities, the proud and quarrelsome towns, each guarding its own liberties, the long shadow of Rome lying over all of it. She went down into that world as the consort of the man who claimed to be the heir of the Caesars, and she came back up over the mountains, having been crowned in the imperial style at the very heart of it. Whatever else her life held afterward, she had stood where she stood in Italy, and she carried the memory of it home like a jewel sewn into the lining of a coat, hidden, but always there, worth more to her than anything England would later offer. Her marriage to Henry lasted, all told, about 11 years, and it produced no child that lived. We do not know why. There may have been pregnancies that ended in loss. The records are silent, or they contradict one another, as records of such private griefs tend to. What we know for certain is that when Henry V died, in the spring of 1125, the Empress Matilda was a widow of about 23, with no living children, no clear place in the empire's future, and a title that was hers for life, but that would pass no further down through her. She had spent 15 years becoming wholly German. She had governed in her husband's name. She had been crowned at the height of the Christian world, and now, in a single death, the entire structure of her life was pulled out from under her, and she had to decide, at 23, what she would become next. The princes of the empire would have kept her on in some honoured but slowly fading role, an imperial widow growing year by year a little less important as new reigns rose around her. She might have stayed and dwindled, but far away in her father's island kingdom, events were already in motion that would reach across the sea and pull her back over the water she had crossed as a frightened child. Back into a future no one had ever planned for her, and which would devour the rest of her life. Whatever the private sorrows of those years, the lost hopes, the empty cradle, the slow understanding that there would be no imperial child, the public life of the Empress went steadily on, and it was a life of real consequence. She travelled the empire at her husband's side and often in his place. She set her hand and her seal to documents that governed the lives of distant men. She was petitioned, deferred to, treated as a power. When the emperor was occupied with his endless quarrel with the Pope or his campaigns in Italy, it was the Empress who held things steady in his name. And she did it well enough that her reputation in Germany outlasted her by generations. Long after she had gone back to the West, there were those in the empire who remembered her with respect. This is the part of her life that England never saw and never credited. When she came back across the sea and asked the lords of her father's kingdom to accept her as their ruler, they saw a woman, and a difficult one, and an unprecedented claim. What they did not see, because it had happened far away and in another tongue, was that she had already done the thing they swore was impossible. She had governed. The proof was simply on the wrong side of the channel. Written in German charters, the barons of England would never read. To understand why her father suddenly needed her, we have to go back 5 years, to a single night on the Norman coast that broke the whole careful shape of the dynasty. On the 25th of November, in the year 1120, a ship went down in the dark off the harbour of Barfleur, and in sinking it destroyed the patient work of King Henry's entire reign in a few freezing hours. The ship was called the White Ship, and the story of its loss is among the most famous disasters of the medieval centuries, partly for who was aboard her, and partly for how needless, how stupid, how avoidable the disaster was. The king and his court had been in Normandy, and the crossing back to England was to be made by the assembled royal fleet. Among the vessels waiting in the harbour was a fine, fast new ship, whose master came to the king and begged the honour of carrying the king's son home to England. But before we go to that night on the Norman coast, stay a moment with the choice the young widow faced in Germany, because it tells us something about her. When Henry V died, Matilda was about 23, childless, an empress with a title for life and no clear future. She could have remained in the empire. There were honours she might have kept, a place she might have held, a slow and dignified fading into the role of an imperial dowager. The German princes did not push her out, and there is a thread in the sources suggesting she was reluctant to leave at all, that the empire had become her home in a way England never was, that she went back across the sea to her father's summons with a heavy heart. Who could blame her? England was a half-remembered country whose language she had half forgotten. The empire was where she had grown up, governed, been crowned, been somebody. To go back was to become a daughter again, a counter to be moved by her father's hand. After 15 years of being a power in her own right, she went because her father commanded it and because the pull of her own dynasty's future was strong. But she went, one suspects, knowing she was trading the settled height she had reached for an uncertain and probably lesser future. She could not have guessed how much more uncertain, or how much would be asked of her, in the country she was going home to. That son was William, called the Atheling, an old English word for a prince of the royal blood, Matilda's only legitimate brother, about 17 years old, the single male heir. The boy upon whom every plan and hope for the future of the dynasty had been built. The king himself had already gone aboard another vessel and sailed William with a boisterous laughing company of the young nobility of England and Normandy, boarded the White Ship to follow after. And then they did not follow, not at once, because the evening on the moored ship slid into a celebration. There was wine, and a great deal of it, for the young lords and for the crew alike. When priests came down to the water to bless the ship before she sailed, as custom demanded, the drunken company laughed them away from the side. By the time the vessel at last cast off into the cold November dark, much of the company aboard her, and fatally, the men at the oars, had been drinking for hours. The loss of him was not only a private grief, but the collapse of an entire design. Everything the old king had built rested on this one boy. The careful marriages, the alliance with Anjou first arranged for William, the whole patient architecture of the succession, all of it assumed a living son to inherit. With William drowned, the architecture had nothing to stand on, and the cruelty of it, the thing that must have gnawed at the king in the years that followed, was how needless the whole disaster had been. Not a battle lost, not a plague, not the hand of an enemy, only wine and darkness, and a boastful drunken crew driving a ship onto a rock that everyone in Barfleur knew was there. A kingdom's future thrown away on a single careless night. The king had survived war and rebellion and the murderous politics of his own family to make himself master of England and Normandy both, and then watched it all come apart because a ship full of young people had drunk too much and steered too hard for open water in the dark. There is no lesson in it, no justice, nothing but the blind accident that history sometimes turns on, and it turned, that night, toward his daughter. The mouth of the harbour at Barfleur is guarded by rocks, and the safe channel out into open water must be steered with knowledge and with care. The crew, drunk and boastful, and hot to overtake the king's ship that had gone on ahead, drove the white ship hard for the open sea in the black of night, and they put her straight onto a rock that lay hidden just below the surface. The hull stove in along one side. The cold sea came up through the broken timbers faster than anyone could think, and then there was only the dark and the rising water and the screaming and the cold that kills a body in minutes in a November sea. Almost everyone aboard was lost. The young prince, it was said, was got down into a small boat and might have been rowed clear to safety. But as the boat pulled away, he heard the cries of his half-sister still in the water behind him, and he ordered it turned back for her. And when it came among the drowning, so many desperate hands seized its sides to climb aboard that it was swamped and went under too. By the cold, grey morning, the heir to England and Normandy was dead, and with him a whole bright generation of the sons and daughters of the great houses of two countries, drowned within sight of a harbour they had only just left. One man lived, a butcher of all people, who had gone aboard merely to collect some debts owed him, and who clung through the freezing night to a piece of floating wreckage until the dawn brought fishermen. He carried the news ashore. The cold of a November sea is a killer in its own right, faster than drowning for many. A body in that water loses its strength in minutes, the limbs growing heavy and useless, the mind slowing, the cold reaching in toward the heart. For the young and the strong aboard the white ship, used to thinking themselves immortal, it would have come as a shock beyond reckoning one moment, a celebration on a fine new ship, wine and laughter and the bright confidence of youth, and the next the black water closing over them and the cold taking hold, and the harbour lights of Barfleur impossibly near and impossibly far. Most could not swim, few in that age could. The dark and the cold and the panic did the rest. Of all the bright company that had boarded laughing, only one came ashore alive, and he the least of them. A tradesman in a thick coat who clung to a spar through the night. The flower of two countries' youth went down within sight of land because of wine and darkness and a boast. It is the kind of accident that happens, and there is no sense to be made of it, and the kingdom's whole future turned on it, all the same. The chroniclers say that when word at last reached the king, no one among his household dared to be the one to tell him, and that they pushed a small boy forward in the end to break it, and that when Henry understood what he was being told, he fell to the ground and had to be carried to his chamber, and that from that day forward he was never again seen to smile. The grief was real and human, but the political catastrophe was greater even than the grief, and the king, being the king he was, would have known it before the boy had finished speaking. He had spent a patient, ruthless reign building a stable, unquestioned succession around his one legitimate son, and in a single drunken night that son and that succession was simply gone. Henry had fathered a great many children outside his marriage. He was famous for it across his reign, and chief among them was a capable, level-headed, deeply loyal son named Robert, whom the king had made Earl of Gloucester, and who will matter enormously before this story is done. But by the unbending law and custom of the age, an illegitimate son, however able, however beloved, could not inherit a crown. The bastard was barred, and that was the end of it. Henry now had one legitimate child left alive in all the world. She was the Empress Matilda, far off in Germany, married to another man and a woman. And for the next several years the old king tried every other path he could find before. At last, he turned to her. He tried first to make himself another legitimate son. His own queen, the elder Matilda of the Old English line, had died not long before the wreck. Within months of the White Ship going down, the king remarried in haste, taking a young wife named Adeliza of Louvain, chosen for her youth and her good family, and above all, for the children she might bear him. They stayed married for years. No child ever came. The king, who had scattered offspring across his realm with such ease, all his life could not, with his young second wife, get the one child he now needed more than crown or treasure. The years went by, and Adeliza's chamber stayed empty, and slowly, against every instinct of his age and his own preference, Henry was forced toward a conclusion no king before him had reached. His only road to passing his crown to his own blood ran through his daughter. So when Henry V died in Germany in 1125, and the widowed empress sat in her foreign court, wondering what was now to become of her, her father sent across the sea for her. He needed her home. He had decided to make her his heir. She came back in 1126, and the return must have been strange, almost beyond telling. She had left England a child of 8, who could barely have held a memory of the place. She returned a woman of about 23 or 24. An empress, a widow, formed root and branch by a foreign court, speaking the language of her birth, perhaps haltingly, knowing the customs of her father's realm hardly at all. She had been the consort of the most exalted ruler in the Western world. Now she was a daughter recalled to her father's house to be used, once again, for the purposes of the dynasty. As she had been used at 8, she brought back with her the title she would never surrender. A handful of imperial treasures said to include holy relics and a great jeweled crown, and an absolute, bone-deep conviction of her own dignity. A conviction she had every right to hold, and which England would find, over the bitter years to come, very nearly impossible to swallow. She was proud, and she had earned the pride honestly. But the pride of an empress in Germany, and the pride of a woman asking the lords of England to bend the knee to her as their sovereign, were two entirely different matters in the eyes of those lords. And the difference would cost her almost everything. Among those treasures, the chroniclers tell us, was the hand of St. James the Apostle, a relic of extraordinary prestige that she had carried out of the empire, and that her father's foundation at Reading would treasure for centuries after. Think of what such an object meant in that age. A relic of an apostle was not a curiosity or an ornament. It was a point of contact with the holy, an object pilgrims would travel far to touch, a source of prestige and sanctity that money could not buy and that conferred standing on whoever held it. That Matilda brought it west with her, out of the empire and home to England, is a small sign of how she understood herself. Not as a woman returning empty-handed to throw herself on her father's mercy, but as an empress bringing the dignities of the empire with her, carrying the holy and the imperial together in her own baggage. The crown she would lose, the title she would keep, and the relics she carried said, to anyone who understood such matters, exactly who she believed she was. And there was the language, which is no small thing in measuring how foreign she had become. She had left England at 8, an age by which a child's first tongue is set, but by no means finished growing. And she had spent the next 16 years immersed in German until it became the language of her thought and her dreams and her daily life. The English she came back to would have felt worn and distant, recalled rather than spoken. The accent of the court altered, the idioms moved on. And the language of government in her father's realm was in any case largely Latin and Norman French, not English at all, so that even the speech of power was something she had to take up again from a distance. To return to one's own country and find its very speech half strange is a peculiar kind of exile, and it must have deepened the sense, already strong, that she belonged here only by blood and not by belonging. She was the rightful heir of England, and a stranger in it at the same time, and the two facts sat together uneasily for the rest of her life. The barons felt the strangeness in her and mistrusted it. She felt it in herself and could do nothing to dissolve it. 16 years is a long time to be away, and some doors, once you have been gone that long, never quite open all the way again. Think of what it was to step back onto English soil after 16 years away. The light would have been wrong, or rather right in a way she had half forgotten. The low grey northern light, the wet green of it, the smell of the Channel, and then the smell of England. Wood smoke and damp earth and the sea behind her. The speech in the streets and the halls would have come at her half familiar and half foreign. The language of her infancy worn thin by years of German. The food, the manners, the shape of the buildings, the very rhythm of the court her father kept, all of it she had to learn or relearn as a grown woman when most of those around her had never known anything else. And underneath the strangeness ran a harder thing still. She had come home not as a returning daughter to be cherished, but as an instrument the old king meant to use. She had been used at 8, sent across the sea for an alliance. Now she was being used again at 23, brought back across it for another. She had, in between, governed an empire in her own person. It would have been very hard, stepping back into her father's hall, not to feel the gap between what she had been over there and what she was permitted to be over here. And that gap, that wound to a justified pride, is the key to half of what went wrong for her later. The court she rejoined was her father's, and her father's court was a hard school of its own. Henry I governed England with a thoroughness that was famous and feared. A machinery of sheriffs and justices and exchequer clerks, of written records and royal writs, of revenue counted and accounted for with a precision unusual in that age. He kept his barons in check by a mixture of patronage and menace, raising men up and casting them down, holding their lands and their heirs as sureties, missing very little. To stand in that court was to stand in the presence of a will that had crushed rebellions and outmaneuvered popes, and never, in 35 years, loosened its grip. Matilda was his daughter, and now his heir. And yet even she was kept firmly in her place. Denied the Norman castles she and her husband demanded, reminded that being named to inherit was not the same as being given power to hold. She watched her father govern in these years, as she had once watched her first husband govern the empire, and she learned again the same lesson from a second master. That authority was a thing held by relentless attention and never by right alone. It was good schooling. She would need every scrap of it. Her father moved quickly to nail down her place. At his Christmas court at the end of 1126, and then formally in January of 1127, King Henry gathered the leading men of England, the bishops, the earls, the barons, the men whose swords and lands and consent were the actual working power of the realm, and required of them a solemn oath. They were to recognize the Empress Matilda as the lawful heir to England and to Normandy, and to accept her as their ruler, should the king die with no legitimate son. Everyone standing in that hall understood how strange and how heavy a thing was being asked. No woman had ever ruled England in her own right. There was no precedent for it, no settled ceremony, no agreed idea of how such a reign could even be made to work in practice. A queen, in the understanding of the age, was the wife of a king, the ornament beside the power, not the power itself. The notion of a queen who was herself the sovereign, who held the authority in her own hands, rather than standing decoratively beside the man who held it, cut against the deepest assumptions of everyone present. And yet, one by one, the men of the realm came forward and swore. The mood of that gathering must have been strained beneath its solemnity. The barons were being asked to do something none of them had done before, and many of them plainly disliked. And a king who knew his men was watching to see who hesitated. There would have been those who swore readily out of loyalty or calculation, those who swore with private reservations already forming, and those who swore because the king's eye was on them and refusal was unthinkable in that hall, whatever they might decide later in the safety of their own lands. An oath given under such conditions is a brittle promise, however sacred its form, because it binds the body in the hall more surely than it binds the heart that goes home afterward. The old king, shrewd as he was, must have known this, and it is why he made them swear not once, but more than once, across his last years. Piling oath on oath as though sheer repetition could make the oath hold. It could not. You cannot make men want an outcome by making them swear to it. And when the moment came and the king was dead, the wanting or the not wanting proved stronger than all the oaths. But that lay in the future. On the day itself, in the hall, with the relics gleaming and the king watching, it looked as though the succession had been settled for good. They swore on holy relics, and in the medieval mind that was no empty piece of theatre. An oath laid upon the bones of the saints bound the immortal soul of the man who swore it. To break such an oath was to put one's own salvation into the fire. So the lords who stepped forward to lay their hands on the relics and swear to accept the Empress were wagering their eternal fate on the keeping of that promise. There was even a quarrel in the swearing. A quarrel over who should have the honour of going first between Robert of Gloucester, the king's loyal illegitimate son, and Stephen of Blois, the king's nephew, the son of the conqueror's daughter, Adela. Both men wanted the precedence. It seems a small matter, a piece of ceremonial vanity over who bowed first. But hold the name Stephen of Blois in your mind, because it was this same nephew, this very man jostling for the privilege of being first to swear his loyalty to Matilda upon holy relics, who would within a few short years break that oath without flinching, snatch the crown the instant her father stopped breathing, and spend nearly 2 decades keeping it from her by every means at his command. The oath of 1127 was the whole foundation of her claim. It was also, as the years would prove with terrible clarity, worth exactly as much as the men who swore it chose, when the moment came, to make it worth. Picture the hall in which it was done. The lords of England assembled at the king's command, the bishops in their robes, the earls and the barons in their furs against the winter cold. The relics brought out and set where every man could see them, a casket of gold and crystal perhaps, holding the bones of some saint, the most sacred objects the age possessed. One by one the magnates came forward under the eyes of the whole assembly and the eyes of the king, and laid their hands upon the holy things, and swore. The words bound them before God. To swear falsely upon such relics was not merely to lie to the king, it was to imperil one's own soul for eternity, to invite the wrath of the saint whose bones lay under one's hand. This was the most solemn pledge the medieval world knew how to make. And the king, watching his nobles swear it, must have believed he had at last secured the prize he most wanted, that the oath, sworn on the bones of the saints, would hold where mere words could not. He was wrong. He had reckoned without the simple truth that men who have decided what they want will find a way to tell themselves that even an oath sworn on holy relics need not bind them. But on that day, in that hall, it looked as solid as anything in the world. Having named her his heir before God and the relics, her father now needed to do a thing that cut hard against the dignity he had just conferred. He needed to marry her off again. An heir, even a female one, especially a female one, was expected to come with a husband. A man to fight her wars, to father the grandsons who would carry the line on past her. To give the proud and doubtful barons someone they could more easily picture themselves following into battle. And the old king had a particular alliance in mind for her. He chose for his imperial daughter a boy named Geoffrey, heir to the county of Anjou, a powerful territory pressed against the southern border of Normandy, whose friendship or its enmity could secure the duchy or set it ablaze. As cold policy, the match made excellent sense. As a thing asked of Matilda, it asked a very great deal. And she did not pretend otherwise. Consider honestly what she was being told to accept. She had been Empress, crowned at the summit of Christendom, consort of a man more than twice her age and immense in his dignity and his power. Now she was to be handed to a boy of about 15. She herself was about 25, the son of a mere count, a green, untried youth, remembered by history chiefly for the sprig of bright yellow broom flower, the planta genista, that he is said to have worn in his cap, and from which his descendants would one day take the name Plantagenet. To go from Empress of the Romans to the wife of the boy heir of Anjou was, to a woman who weighed rank as carefully and as proudly as Matilda did, very close to a humiliation. The sources record that she objected to it. Her father overruled her objection, as kings and fathers of that age overruled the objections of daughters, and in 1128 the marriage was made. The Empress, for she still, always, insisted on being called the Empress, became the wife of Geoffrey of Anjou. It should surprise no one at all that the marriage began very badly indeed. And yet we should be careful not to make her merely the victim of the match, because that is not quite the woman either. She objected. Yes, she resented it. Yes. But she was also, always, a player of the dynastic game. And once the marriage was made, she pursued its advantages as hard as anyone alive. The Norman castles she and Geoffrey demanded of her father were no whim. They were a calculated bid for the real power her position as heir ought to carry. And she pressed for them with a persistence that helped poison her last relations with the old king. She understood, as well as any man of her age, that a claim without strongholds and revenue behind it was so much parchment, and she meant to have the substance and not merely the title. The proud empress who disdained the Angevin match was the very same clear-eyed woman who, having made it, set about extracting every ounce of advantage it could yield. That combination, the wounded pride and the cold calculation, lodged side by side in one person, is the truest picture of her we can draw. She was never only the injured great lady, the chroniclers half admired and half condemned. She was a working ruler in an age that had no category for such a thing in a woman, and she played the hand she was dealt for everything it would bear. It began so badly that within little more than a year the two of them had separated. The sources do not entirely agree on who sent whom away, but the marriage broke down fast, and Matilda left Anjou and went back, for a time, toward her father's territories. It is not hard to see why. A vast gap in age, a far vaster gap in rank and dignity, a proud widowed empress in her middle 20s and a teenage boy not yet done growing. A match neither of them had chosen and both of them resented. Shut such two people up together by the command of a king, and you should expect sparks, not warmth. And yet this quarrel is not where the marriage ended, because it could not be allowed to end there. It was a political necessity that bound two countries together, and neither party was free to simply walk away from it. In time, under the steady pressure of the old king and the plain logic of their situation, they came back together. Whatever passed between them behind closed doors, whatever was endured or forgiven or simply set aside, they did at last make the marriage work in the one sense that finally mattered to the dynasty and to history. They produced sons. It is not hard, across the centuries, to feel for both of them in this. Geoffrey was a boy of 15, handsome and high-spirited and proud of his own house. Suddenly, married to a famous widow 11 years his senior, who had been the consort of an emperor and who can have made very little secret of how far beneath her she considered the match. Matilda was a woman in her middle 20s who had stood near the summit of Christendom and was now expected to play the dutiful young wife to a green count's son, scarcely old enough to grow a beard. In a small southern court that must have seemed provincial and poor after the splendours of the empire. Neither had chosen the other. Each had real cause for grievance, that they struck sparks rather than warmth, that they separated within little more than a year. Surprises no one who looks at the human reality of it, rather than the diplomatic logic. What is more surprising, and more to both their credit, is that they eventually made it work, not as a love match, perhaps, but as a partnership of interest, solid enough to produce the sons on whom the whole future turned. Marriages of that age were not asked to be happy. They were asked to be fruitful and to hold. And theirs, against its terrible beginning, did both. The county of Anjou that she came to was not the empire, and the contrast can only have stung. Where she had known imperial cities and the grandeur of Italy, Anjou was a compact southern French territory, prosperous and well governed by the standards of its neighbours, but provincial beside what she had left. Its capital at Angers, its castles along the Loire, its count's court with its hunting and its local quarrels. All of it must have seemed a great diminishment to a woman who had been crowned near Rome, and she was expected to take her place in it not as a sovereign, but as the wife of the heir, subordinate, decorative, waiting. For a person of her training and her pride, this was close to intolerable, and her early flight from the marriage was as much a refusal of that diminishment as a quarrel with a boy. Yet Anjou, for all that she disdained it, would have its revenge on history in the happiest way. It was the marriage to its heir that gave her the sons, and it was the Angevin inheritance, joined to her own claim and her son's conquests, that would build the vast dominion her grandsons ruled. The county she looked down on became, through her, the root of an empire. She could not have known it. Chafing in Angers in those first bad years, but the future she most wanted came to her through the marriage she most resented. The first of them, and the most important, was born in the spring of 1133 at Le Mans, and was named Henry, after his grandfather the king. The old king's joy can be imagined across the centuries. Here at last, after the drowned heir and the barren second marriage and the unheard-of expedient of naming a daughter, was a grandson, a male child of his own legitimate blood. The thing he had hunted through years of anxiety and prayer and politics. The infant born at Le Mans would grow up to become Henry II of England, one of the most formidable kings the country has ever had. The founder of a dynasty that would rule for over 300 years, the maker of the English common law, the father of Richard the Lionheart and of King John. But all of that lay far off in an unguessed future. For now he was a baby, and his birth quietly changed the whole calculation around his mother. She was no longer merely the designated heir, a woman to be tolerated as a regrettable necessity. She was now the mother of a male heir of the old king's blood. The line had a future running through her own body. A second son, named Geoffrey, followed the next year, and the marriage that had begun in open contempt had become, in the cold ledger of dynasties, a solid success. It is worth dwelling on this child, because so much of what made Matilda's struggle finally worth something runs forward from his cradle at Le Mans. The boy was, from early on, plainly extraordinary, restless, quick, fierce, with a memory that astonished those around him and an energy that wore out everyone who tried to keep pace with him. He would grow into a king who could not sit still, who rode the length of his enormous dominions at a speed that left his court gasping, who governed from Scotland to the Pyrenees and seemed never to sleep. But all of that was folded, for now, into an infant in his mother's arms. And the meaning of him to her was simpler and deeper than any of it. He was the proof that her line had a future. He was the answer to every man who said a woman's claim led nowhere. Whatever happened to her own ambitions in the years to come, and the worst of it was still ahead. There was now a male heir of the old king's blood growing in the world, and he was hers. When everything else was stripped from her, when the crown slipped away in London, and the cause guttered after Oxford, this is what she had left, and it turned out to be enough. A son, growing, in whom her whole defeated claim could one day rise again and win. The two boys were not the end of it. In time there would be a third son as well. And the line that had once hung by the single thread of a drowned prince was now secure in a way the old king never lived to see. Where the white ship had taken his only legitimate son and left the succession in ruins, his daughter's marriage to the Count of Anjou had restored it threefold. The dynasty that the wreck off Barfleur had so nearly ended was carried on, in the end by the very child the old king had been most reluctant to rely upon. The daughter he had sent away to Germany at 8, recalled at 23, and married against her will to a boy she despised. From that resented match came the heirs who saved his line. There is a hard irony in it that he did not live to taste. He spent his last years quarrelling bitterly with the daughter and son-in-law on whom his whole future actually rested, refusing them the castles they demanded, dying estranged from the one branch of his family through which his blood would in fact endure. The future he wanted came through exactly the people he could not get along with at the end. Such is the way of things, in families and in kingdoms both. But the very fact of these grandsons, in the last years of the old king's life, became a source of bitter friction rather than of peace. Geoffrey of Anjou now wanted something solid in his hand, in return for his sons and his loyalty. He wanted custody of certain castles on the Norman frontier. Strongholds he regarded as owed to him, and to his wife as part of her inheritance and her dowry. Matilda backed her husband in the demand, because his strength was now her strength and her son's. And the three of them were bound together at last by the future they shared. The old king flatly refused to hand the castles over while he still drew breath. He had named his daughter his heir. He had not made her his partner. And he had no intention whatever of giving away the levers of real power before he was safely dead. The result, in the last year of his reign, was a hard and bitter quarrel between the old king and the daughter and son-in-law on whom he had staked his entire succession. And it was while this quarrel still festered, unresolved, Matilda and Geoffrey, estranged from the old man and pressing him hard over those Norman castles, that in the late autumn of 1135, King Henry I fell ill in Normandy. He had been hunting and feasting after the hunt. The chroniclers, who never could resist a moral pointed at a king, said he had gorged himself on lampreys, a rich, fatty, eel-like fish that his own physicians had warned him against, and that the lampreys killed him. Whatever the true cause, he sickened, and within a few days it was plain to everyone around the bed that the old king was dying. He died on the 1st of December, 1135, in Normandy, with his daughter and heir, not at his side but estranged from him and miles away. And in the fatal gap between his last breath and the news of it reaching the men who would act upon it, the entire structure he had spent 35 careful, ruthless years building simply came apart in his hands as they cooled. This is the hinge of the whole story, the single point on which everything afterward turns. The crown had been promised to Matilda. The great men had sworn it upon holy relics, with their souls in the balance. But Matilda was in Anjou, on the wrong side of a quarrel with her now dead father. Married to a man the Norman barons distrusted and the English barons disliked, and she was fatally, in the eyes of that moment, a woman asking men to do a thing no men had ever done. And there was another candidate, closer to hand, faster on his feet, and possessed of everything she lacked in the panic of the hour. His name was Stephen of Blois. Imagine the hours after his death from inside the crisis, because everything turned on them. A king is dead in Normandy. The news must travel to his daughter in Anjou, to his nephew wherever he is, to the barons scattered across 2 countries, to the men who hold the castles and the treasury and the ports. And whoever acts first, whoever reaches the levers of power before the others have so much as heard, holds an enormous advantage, because a throne abhors a vacuum, and the realm wants above all to know who is king. Matilda was estranged from her father, quarrelling with him over the Norman castles, far to the south in Anjou. She could not move quickly, she did not even hold the initiative of grief, for she and the old man had parted in anger. Stephen, by contrast, was poised, near the coast, ready, unburdened by any such estrangement. He heard, and he moved, and by moving fast, he made himself a fact before his cousin could make herself a presence. It was not that the barons weighed the 2 of them side by side and chose him. It was that he was there and acting while she was still absorbing the news, and by the time she could respond he was crowned, anointed, and king, and unmaking a crowned king is a far harder thing than stopping an uncrowned one. The whole long war flowed out of those first few unrecoverable hours. There is a grim fittingness in the way the chroniclers told it. The great King of England, the man who had taken a throne in 3 days and held it for 35 years by sheer relentless will, brought down at the last by a dish of fish he had been told not to eat. Whether the lampreys truly killed him hardly matters now. What matters is that he died in Normandy, away from England. With a succession he had spent years securing balanced on a knife's edge, and with his named heir estranged from him and far away in Anjou. He had done everything a king could do to bind the future. He had married his daughter to an emperor, and then to a count. He had taken a second wife to try for a son. He had gathered his barons and made them swear, twice over, upon the bones of the saints. And in the end, none of it held, because the one matter he could not arrange was to have his heir standing in England, at his side, in arms, on the day he died. That single gap. The wrong person in the wrong place at the one irreversible moment undid the work of a lifetime, and a faster, nearer man stepped through it before the old king was cold. Stephen was the dead king's nephew, the son of the conqueror's daughter Adela, and he had been one of the very men who swore the oath to Matilda, had quarrelled, you will remember, over the honour of swearing it first. He had been raised at his uncle's court and richly endowed there with broad lands in England and Normandy. He had married a formidable, wealthy, iron-willed heiress, confusingly also named Matilda, who was Countess of Boulogne in her own right. He was charming, open-handed, genuinely brave, widely liked, and he was a man. When the news of the old king's death came across the water, Stephen did not hesitate the way his cousin the Empress, pinned far off in Anjou, was forced to. He moved, and he moved fast. He crossed the channel at speed, and made straight for London, where the citizens came out and acclaimed him. And then for Winchester, where the royal treasury lay, and where his own brother Henry happened to be bishop. A brother whose support would prove worth more than an army. He laid hands on the treasury, the silver sinew of power, exactly as his uncle had done a generation before. He secured the backing of the church, which mattered more than almost anything else in the making of a king, for no man could be lawfully crowned without it. And within a few weeks of his uncle's death, on the 22nd of December, 1135, Stephen of Blois was crowned King of England at Westminster. The oath lay broken on the floor of the abbey. The crown was taken. Matilda, the lawful heir, the Empress, the daughter sworn to before God and holy relics, had been on the wrong side of the water at the one moment that mattered, and a faster man had simply stepped into the empty throne. Picture his crowning that December, and you see at once both the strength and the rot in his position. Westminster Abbey, the same church where his uncle had been crowned and where kings of England were made. The anointing with holy oil that set a king apart from other men and was held to be very nearly a sacrament. The lords of the realm gathered to acclaim him, the church laying its hands on him through the archbishop. The crown of England set on his head with every form observed. To all eyes it was a true and lawful making of a king, and from that day Stephen was the anointed sovereign, a status not lightly undone. And yet the abbey was emptier than it should have been. The greatest men were not all there. The thing had been done in haste, in a matter of weeks, by a man racing to get the crown on his head before anyone could gather to stop him. Everyone present knew, however little they said it aloud, that there was a living heir who had been sworn to upon the relics, and that the speed of all this was the speed of a man seizing something before its rightful owner could come for it. The oil was holy and the crown was real. But the flaw was there from the first hour under everything, and it never healed. For a few years the rot did not show. Stephen reigned and was accepted, and the barons did him homage. And a stranger arriving in England might have seen nothing but a settled king on a secure throne. But the flaw worked away underneath, slow and patient. Every man who had sworn the oath to Matilda carried, somewhere, the knowledge that he had broken it. Every churchman knew that a sworn succession had been set aside. And the moment Stephen showed weakness, the moment he quarrelled with the church, or alienated a powerful baron, or stumbled in war, the buried knowledge would surface, and men would remember that there was another claimant with a better right. That is exactly what happened. Stephen was not a bad man, and not entirely a bad king, but he was an inconstant one, generous and changeable, quick to make enemies, and quicker to forgive them. And as his early goodwill wore thin, the old flaw in his title began to show through. Robert of Gloucester's defection in 1138 was the first great crack. After it, the whole structure began visibly to fail. The crown had been taken in 3 weeks. Holding it would take the rest of his life and cost the country nearly 20 years of war. There remains the question of why they let him do it, why the men who had sworn upon holy relics to accept Matilda turned so readily, so quickly, to Stephen. It is one of the central questions of her whole story, and the answer is a tangle of motives, no single one of them quite creditable, all of them painfully human. Some claimed the oath had been extracted under pressure and was therefore not freely given, and so not binding on the soul. Some claimed, very conveniently, that the old king had changed his mind upon his deathbed and released them all from it, a story impossible to confirm or to disprove, and exactly the kind of claim men make aloud when they have already privately decided what they intend to do. Many of them simply could not stomach the idea of a woman ruler set over them, and reached gratefully for any justification that would let them avoid it. Many more disliked and feared her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, and could not bear the thought of Angevin hands reaching into England through Matilda's marriage bed. And Stephen was there, and ready, and male, and pleasant, and the path of least resistance ran straight through him. So they took that path, and they told themselves it was lawful, or that it did not truly matter, or that a strong man on the throne now was worth more than a sworn promise to a distant woman. And for a short while it seemed they might get away with it cleanly. It is worth setting the two cousins side by side, because the war was in many ways a contest between two temperaments as much as two claims. Stephen was warm, brave, generous, and liked a man people wanted to follow, quick to forgive, slow to be cruel, chivalrous to a fault that cost him battles he might have won. Matilda was none of those easy things. She was proud, hard, unbending, difficult to like, and impossible to push. A woman who had governed an empire and would not pretend to be less than she was, to soothe the feelings of men she considered her inferiors. In the short run, in the winning of hearts, Stephen had every advantage. People flocked to his charm and recoiled from her coldness, and the chroniclers, charmed too, wrote her down and him up. But in the long run, the harder metal told. Stephen's very softness, his habit of letting enemies go, of forgiving the unforgivable, of failing to press a victory home, kept him from ever ending the war, while Matilda's flint-hard refusal to quit kept her cause alive through defeats that would have finished a softer claimant. He was the better man to drink with, and the worse man to follow into a long war. She was the reverse, and it was her hardness, not his charm, that in the end put her blood on the throne. History for a long time took the chroniclers at their word and made Matilda the villain of her own story, the proud, shrewish woman whose arrogance threw away a crown that fell into her lap, set against poor, brave, likeable Stephen. It has taken centuries and a more careful reading of the same sources to see how unfair that verdict was. The men who wrote her down were churchmen of her own hostile age, steeped in the assumption that a woman who wielded power was a thing against nature, reaching by instinct for the words proud and harsh and unwomanly to describe behaviour they would have called firm and kingly in a man. Strip out the prejudice, baked into the very vocabulary, and a different figure emerges from the same facts. A ruler of immense courage and endurance, dealt an almost impossible hand, who came within a day of winning outright, and who, having lost that chance, refused to be beaten and in the end secured everything for her son. The woman the chroniclers condemned and the woman the facts describe are not the same woman at all. The first is a caricature drawn by men who could not forgive her sex. The second is one of the most formidable figures of her century, and the truer for being harder to caricature. But Matilda did not accept it, and neither did the men whose own consciences and interests still bound them to her. And the broken oath did not simply evaporate, it festered, the way a wound festers when something is left inside it. Across the Channel, the Empress and her husband at once began to press her claim by force in Normandy, seizing what castles and territory they could reach. And in England, the legitimacy of Stephen's crown carried, at its very heart, a flaw that no amount of charm and open-handedness could ever wholly smooth away. He had been crowned, anointed, accepted, but he had taken the throne over a living, legitimate heir who had been publicly and solemnly sworn to by the assembled realm upon the bones of the saints. That flaw was a crack running through the foundation of everything he would build, and into that crack, over the years to come, the edifice of his reign would slowly, grindingly subside. Matilda fought first in the only court available to her that ranked above the courts of kings, the court of the Church. She took her case to the Pope himself. The argument she made was clean and powerful. She was the legitimate child of the late King Henry. The lords of England, Stephen chief among them, had sworn upon holy relics, with their very souls in pledge, to accept her as heir. Stephen had broken that sacred oath in order to seize a crown that was hers by right and by their own solemn promise. Let the Church, the appointed guardian of oaths and the keeper of souls, declare the truth of the matter before God and all Christendom. It was a strong case, and it was argued ably on her behalf at the papal court, and it kept her claim alive and breathing, in the one arena where Stephen's grip on the treasury and the throne counted for nothing at all. But the papacy, weighing the sheer scale of the disorder that overturning a crowned and anointed king would loose upon the world, declined in the end to rule against him outright. Stephen kept his crown in the eyes of Rome. And yet the very fact that the question had been argued so seriously, at so high a level, kept burning the one truth Stephen would have given a great deal to put out, that there was another rightful claimant living, and that many serious men believed in her right. The legal fight settled nothing in itself. It was always, in the end, going to come down to England and to war. For the first years the war was fought mostly in Normandy and around the edges by partisans and proxies, while Matilda built her case and gathered her strength and waited for the moment to cross in person. The decisive shift came in 1138, when the most important man in England, after the king himself, declared for her. Robert, Earl of Gloucester, the old king's loyal illegitimate son, Matilda's own half-brother, the richest and most respected magnate in the land, formally renounced his allegiance to Stephen and took up his half-sister's cause. This changed everything at a stroke. Robert was no distant claimant's hired agent. He held vast estates across the west of England, and in Normandy he commanded the loyalty of a great web of lesser barons and knights, and he was, by the common judgment of his age, the ablest soldier and the steadiest head among all the magnates of the realm. With Robert for her champion, Matilda at last had a real foundation in England itself, a whole region of the country, the west around Bristol and Gloucester, that would hold firm for her, and a commander who could turn her claim from a lawyer's argument into an army standing in a field. In the autumn of 1139, she judged that the moment had finally come. She crossed the Channel and landed in England to fight for her crown, in person. And we should not lose the woman herself inside the movements of armies, because the war was not an abstraction to her. It was the daily texture of more than a decade of her life. It meant riding hard between strongholds with an armed escort, never wholly sure of the loyalty of the next castle. It meant councils held late into the night by candlelight, weighing which lord could be trusted and which was wavering where the next blow should fall, how long the silver would last. It meant the cold of winter campaigns and the mud of spring ones, the constant calculation of risk, the discipline of showing a steady face to followers who took their courage from hers. It meant, more than anything, endurance. The refusal to give up a cause that for years on end could neither be won nor be quite lost. The will to wake each morning into the same grinding uncertainty and carry on. Men called her hard. She had every reason to be hard. Softness would not have survived a week of it. What looks, in the hostile chronicles, like an unwomanly coldness looks very different once you understand what she was actually doing. Holding a losing position together by sheer force of will, year after year, in a country at war. When almost everyone advised her, the sensible thing was to yield. She did not yield. That, in the end, is the whole of her character, in a single fact. And here it is worth saying plainly what kind of war this was, because it was not the kind we tend to picture. There were few great pitched battles. Lincoln was the rare exception, and its rarity is exactly why it mattered so much. This was instead a war of castles and sieges and raids, of besieging a stronghold for weeks to starve out the garrison, of burning the country around an enemy's fortress to deny him supply, of midnight marches and surprise assaults, and the slow strangling of one fortified place after another. It was fought by relatively small forces, a few hundred knights here, a garrison of dozens there, but it ground on for nearly 20 years, precisely because no single blow could end it. A castle taken in the spring might be lost again by autumn. A lord who held for the king 1 year held for the empress the next, as his own advantage shifted. The map of who held what was a patchwork that changed constantly and settled nowhere. For Matilda, it meant a life, through these years, of constant movement and constant uncertainty, of councils held in one stronghold after another, of never being entirely safe and never being entirely lost, of a cause that could neither win outright nor be wholly stamped out. It was a war of attrition and endurance, as it turned out, was the one quality she had in greater measure than anyone expected. The castles were everything, and a word about them helps the whole period make sense. In a settled kingdom, the right to build a castle was a jealously guarded royal privilege, because a castle was power made of stone, a base from which a man could dominate the country for miles around, levy what he liked, defy whoever he chose. When royal authority collapsed in the war, that control collapsed with it, and across England men threw up castles without anyone's leave, hasty earthwork and timber strongholds, many of them, raised fast to seize a stretch of country or guard a stolen gain. These unlicensed castles, the chronicler's adulterine castles, were the visible symptom of the disease. Each one was a little tyranny, its lord answerable to no one, its garrison living off the country around it. From them came much of the misery the Peterborough monk described, the seizing, the torturing for silver, the wasting of the land. And when the war finally ended and order returned, one of the first tasks of the new king, Matilda's son, was to pull them down by the hundred, to break the stone tyrannies and restore the royal monopoly on fortification that alone could keep the peace. The rise of the castles charts the fall into anarchy. Their demolition charts the climb back out. Between the two lay the wasted years of Matilda's war. Her landing produced one of the strangest episodes of the entire war, and one that tells you a great deal about the peculiar, half-chivalrous, half-ruthless character of the whole conflict. She came ashore on the south coast and took shelter at Arundel Castle, the great stronghold of her father's widow Adeliza, who had since remarried and whose household now received the Empress. Stephen, learning that his rival had landed and was lodged behind the walls of Arundel, marched at once and laid siege to the place. He had her. The lawful claimant to his throne was shut up inside a single fortress, and the king had it surrounded. By the hard, simple logic of war, he should have held her there until hunger forced her to yield, and so ended the whole threat in one stroke and one siege. Instead, astonishingly, he let her go. He granted the Empress a safe conduct to leave Arundel and be escorted clear across his own kingdom to join her brother Robert in the west. It seems almost beyond belief. Historians have argued ever since over why he did such a thing. Chivalry, the awkwardness of starving out a lady in the home of the old king's widow, a cool calculation that she was less dangerous turned loose in the west than made a martyr in a siege. The soft counsel of his brother, the bishop. Whatever moved him, the moment captures something essential about Stephen and about this entire war. It was fought, much of the time, by men who could not quite bring themselves to be ruthless enough to actually win against a woman who could quack. The safe conduct from Arundel deserves a moment more. because it is the sort of thing that makes this whole war so strange to modern eyes. Here was Stephen, an usurper by Matilda's lights and a lawful king by his own, with his single most dangerous rival shut up and surrounded in a castle. Hunger and time on his side, victory a matter of patience. And he let her go. He escorted her safely across his own kingdom to join the one man, her brother Robert, most capable of turning her into a real threat. Whatever the mix of motives behind it, and we can only guess at them, the gesture belongs to a world with its own code, in which a great lady besieged in the home of the old king's widow was not simply a military problem to be solved, but a person whose rank and sex placed limits on what an honourable king could do to her. Stephen lived much of his reign by that code, and it cost him dearly. Again and again he had his enemies in his hand and opened his fingers. He could win battles. What he could not do was be ruthless enough to win the war. Matilda, harder and clearer-eyed, would not have let him go had their places been reversed, and she said as much, in effect, by what she did with the freedom he gave her. She went straight to her brother and raised the country against him. So the war settled into England, and it became the grinding, ruinous thing that later ages would name the Anarchy. This is the part of the story where I want you to set down for a moment, the crowns and the oaths and the marching of armies, and think instead about the country itself, about what it was like to be an ordinary living person in England in these years, because the suffering of the people who never chose any of it is the true weight of the whole tale. The kingdom split. Some barons held for Stephen, some for Matilda, and a great many more held for nobody but themselves, switching sides as advantage and fear dictated, using the collapse of central power to settle old scores, to seize a neighbour's land, to throw up castles without anyone's leave. The royal authority that the conqueror and his sons had hammered into the country, the force that had kept a hard peace, however brutal, simply dissolved across whole regions into a patchwork of armed lordships at war with one another, and the people on the land beneath them paid the price of it. We hear almost nothing in the chronicles directly from the people on whom all this fell. They were not the sort whose words were written down. The monks and clerks who kept the records wrote of kings and earls and bishops, of oaths and battles and the movements of armies. But now and then, a phrase breaks the surface of the official story, and we catch, for a heartbeat, the human cost underneath. A line about the dead, lying unburied. About the poor starving in the wasted shires, about people who had once been comfortable reduced to begging on roads they no longer dared to walk. It is the same in every age. The quarrels of the powerful are paid for by those who never had a voice in them. When we follow the Empress through her sieges and her escapes, when we take her side, as it is natural to do, against the cousin who broke his oath and stole her crown, we should keep somewhere in the back of the mind the harder thought that her cause, however just, was also a cause that helped hold a whole country at war with itself for the better part of 20 years, and that the bill for it was paid in fields no one dared to sow and homes no one was left to keep. Picture what that breakdown meant on a single ordinary day in a single ordinary place, somewhere in the contested middle of the country, a village under the shadow of a castle that had been thrown up without license by a lord who answered to no one, the fields half-tilled because no one could be sure of bringing in a harvest that would not be seized or fired before it ripened. The people watchful, listening always for hoofbeats on the road, knowing that armed men might come from either side or from no side at all. That to be thought to have silver hidden in the thatch was to invite a visit no one survived unbroken, a mill standing idle, a church stripped of what little it had once held, the roads thick with the desperate and the dispossessed. Families on the move, with whatever they could carry, looking for a region still at peace, of which there were fewer every season. This was the England the chroniclers meant when they wrote that the land lay waste. Not a battlefield, battles were rare and brief and far between, but a slow, grinding, everyday ruin. The ordinary fabric of life coming apart, thread by thread, under the weight of a quarrel between two cousins over a crown, while the people who held neither crown nor castle simply endured or fled or died. The chronicle written by the monks at Peterborough set down what this felt like from below, and its words have rung down the centuries because they capture the horror that the tidy political narrative leaves out entirely. It described how the men who held the castles filled them with cruel men and seized anyone they thought had goods worth taking, and shut them up and tortured them for their silver, with torments too dreadful to set down fully. It described a countryside where to plough and sow was pointless, because the harvest would only be stolen or burned before it could be reaped. Where whole villages stood empty and silent, their people fled or dead, where the land lay waste for miles. And it set down the line that has outlived everything else from that ruined time that men said openly, in their despair, that Christ and his saints slept. That God himself had turned his face away from England and left it to the mercy of armed men who had none. Whatever the justice of Matilda's claim, whatever the legitimacy of Stephen's crown, this was the true cost of their quarrel laid out on the land. A whole generation of ordinary people caught between contending lords, their fields put to the torch, their stores carried off, their lives held cheap by whoever happened to hold the nearest castle. When we speak of the great struggle for the crown, we should never quite lose sight of them. The unnamed thousands, the ones who paid in full for a quarrel that was never theirs. And yet life did not simply stop, even in the worst of it, because life never does. People still married and buried their dead, and brought in what harvest they could, and baptized their children, and kept the feasts of the church as the year came round. The monks in their houses still copied their manuscripts and sang their offices. Sometimes within sound of the fighting, markets still gathered where it was safe enough to gather. The endurance of ordinary people through such times is itself a kind of quiet heroism that the chronicles, fixed on kings and battles, almost never pause to record. When we picture the wasted land of the Anarchy, we should picture not only the burned village and the empty field, but also the stubborn human business of carrying on, the woman still teaching her daughter to spin, the old man still mending the same wall, the small persistences by which a people outlast the great men who are ruining them. Matilda's war filled nearly 20 years of such lives. The kings and the claimants are remembered. The people who simply endured them are not, and they were the great majority. And the war was, in the end, mostly a thing that happened to them. At the very centre of Matilda's cause, holding all of it together through these years, stood her half-brother Robert, and it is worth pausing properly on him, because without Robert, there would simply be no story to tell. Her claim would have guttered and died in its first year for want of a sword to carry it. Robert of Gloucester was the old king's son by a woman who was never his wife, and that single accident of his birth had barred him forever from the throne. His abilities might otherwise have won him outright. He could not be king. By the iron rule of legitimacy, the crown could never sit upon his head, however well he might have worn it. And so he gave his loyalty, his vast lands, his armies, and in the end his own liberty, to the half-sister who could wear that crown lawfully and whose son would carry the line on into the future. There is something quietly moving in the shape of it. The most capable man of his whole generation, locked out of the throne by an accident of his mother's bed, chose to make himself the instrument of his half-sister's right, rather than grasp at his own advantage in the general chaos, as so many lesser men around him were doing. He became her general, her anchor, her wisest and most trusted counselor, and the one great man whose loyalty to her never once wavered across the entire length of the war. When you picture the war camps in these years, the smell of wood smoke and horses and wet leather, The councils held by candlelight in requisitioned halls, the marches across a broken and frightened country. Picture Robert there at her side or just ahead of her, the steady, professional, unglamorous soldier carrying the cause of his proud and difficult half-sister, because he had decided, in the end, that the right of the thing was hers. We know enough of Robert to see him fairly clearly across the distance of the centuries, and what we see is rare. He was a man of learning as well as war, a patron of scholars, a reader, the dedicatee of one of the great histories of the age, a man who could discuss theology and law and not merely wield a sword. He was steady where others were rash, loyal where loyalty was scarce, and trusted on both sides of the war as a man whose word meant something. He had every quality a king of that age could want, and the one disqualification that overrode them all. Had he been born inside his father's marriage rather than outside it, the whole bloody story might never have happened. He would simply have been king, and a good one, and England would have been spared the anarchy. Instead, he spent his strength and his life lifting his half-sister toward a throne he could not take himself, asking nothing for it but the success of her cause and the future of her son, who was his nephew. There is no more honourable figure in the tangled tale, and when he died, worn out in her service, the cause did not long survive him as a thing she could carry. He was the spine of it, and when the spine went, the body could only be handed on to the son to carry forward. In the deep winter of 1141 came the moment when it all seemed about to fall, at last, into her open hands. The trouble began at Lincoln, where a quarrel over the great castle there drew Stephen north to besiege it. Robert of Gloucester and his allies gathered their forces and marched to relieve the place, and on the 2nd of February, 1141, the two armies met in open battle outside the city walls. It was a hard, cold, bitter fight, fought in winter mud. Stephen, whatever the failings of his judgment, was personally brave to the very edge of recklessness, and when his cause collapsed around him on the field, when his cavalry broke and fled, and his lines came apart, he did not flee with them. He stood and fought on foot by the accounts that come down to us, laying about him first with his sword until it shattered, and then with a great two-handed axe a townsman put into his hand, surrounded on every side, refusing to the last to yield, until at length he was beaten down by sheer weight of numbers and seized alive. The King of England was a prisoner. It is hard to put into words what that meant. The man who had taken her crown was now wholly in Matilda's power, captured in fair fight in open battle. And there was no longer any rival sovereign at liberty anywhere in the kingdom to stand against her. The throne lay open before her, after 6 years of war, after the broken oath and the drawn-out argument before the Pope and the ruin of half the country. The Empress stood at last upon the very threshold of the crown that had been promised her before God when her father was alive. For a few months after Lincoln, the impossible thing seemed to have become merely difficult, and then almost done. The king was a prisoner. There was no rival sovereign at large. The church was coming to terms with her. The great men who had wavered were making their way to her side, as men always make their way toward the winning cause. If you had stood in England in the spring of 1141 and tried to read the future, you would have said the Empress had won, that the standing anomaly of a stolen throne was ending, that England was about to do the unprecedented thing and accept a woman as its sovereign lord. The momentum was all hers. The logic of the situation pointed one way only, and that is exactly why what came next was so shattering. Not a slow defeat ground out over years, but a sudden reversal at the very summit. The cause cresting and breaking in the space of weeks. The crown within reach one moment, and gone the next. The higher she had climbed, the further there was to fall, and she had climbed that spring higher than any woman in England ever had. The fall, when it came at London, was correspondingly complete. Lincoln was the high water mark, the one day when the war produced a clean and total result. And it is worth standing in the cold of that February field to feel the weight of it. The armies were not large by the measure of later ages, but they were the whole strength each side could gather. And they met in the flat wet ground below the city, with the castle and the cathedral looming above. Matilda's cause was carried by Robert of Gloucester and by the wild, dispossessed lords of the Welsh March, who had their own scores to settle with the king. Stephen's men held the higher ground, but the fighting went against them, and as it turned, the king's allies began to slip away, first a few, then many, the cavalry breaking and streaming from the field. And there, in the middle of the collapse, the king himself would not run. It is the one image of Stephen that redeems all his blunders. The anointed king of England, abandoned by his fleeing lords, standing his ground on foot in the mud and the cold, swinging his sword until it broke, and then a great axe until that broke too, laying about him in a ring of enemies, refusing every call to yield, until he was simply borne down by weight of numbers and taken alive. Brave to the end, and beaten to the end. They led him away a prisoner, and for a few months it seemed the war was over and the Empress had won. They brought Stephen to Bristol and put him into honourable but real and guarded captivity, and Matilda set about the careful, necessary, patient work of turning a victory in the field into a lawful accession to the throne. She of all people knew, that it could not be done by force alone. A crown seized by the sword, and nothing more would be as hollow and as crackable as she had always insisted Stephen's was. She needed the church, and she needed the city of London, and she needed every form and ceremony observed in its proper order, because a crown taken outside the forms would carry the same fatal flaw she had spent 6 years denouncing. The key to the church lay, strangely, with Stephen's own brother, Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, who was also at this time the papal legate, the single most powerful churchman in all of England. And in a remarkable turn, this brother of the captured king came to terms with the woman who had captured him. At a solemn gathering he received her, and the church, speaking through him, formally acknowledged her right. She was proclaimed, in the careful and deliberate language chosen for an utterly unprecedented thing, the Lady of the English Domina, Anglorum, a title that marked the stage between being acknowledged as the rightful ruler and the final coronation that alone would make her queen in full. She was not yet crowned, but she held the captured king, she held the support of the church through its own legate, and she held the lawful acknowledgement of her right. All that now remained was London, and the crown itself. She was closer than any woman in the whole history of England had ever come to ruling in her own name. And then, in the space of a very few weeks, she lost the whole of it. Stephen in his Bristol captivity is a strange and poignant figure to hold in the mind for a moment. Here was the anointed King of England, the charming and brave and generous man who had won the love of his people and the backing of the church, sitting a prisoner in a western castle, while the woman he had wronged prepared to take the crown he had taken from her. By the accounts, he was held honourably at first, as befitted a king, but as the months wore on and the danger of his cause being lost entirely grew, his confinement tightened, and there is mention of him being kept in irons. It is a vivid reversal, the usurper become the captive, the winner of the race for the throne, now utterly at the mercy of the cousin he had outrun. And yet even here his luck, or his quality, held. He was too valuable to harm, and too royal to depose easily, and the very fact of his anointing protected him. For to set aside a crowned and consecrated king was a thing that gave even his enemies pause. He waited in his chains while the war turned, and when it turned again at Winchester, his queen's victory and the capture of Robert bought his freedom. He had been as low as a king can be, and still be a king, and he rose from it to fight on for another decade. Few men have ridden the wheel of fortune so far down and so far back up. Stand for a moment in the great church at Winchester in that strange spring of triumph, and feel how close she came. Here was the old capital of the English kings, where the treasury was kept and the dead kings lay. The very place her father had ridden to seize the silver 35 years before. Here the Empress was received by the Church of England in the person of the legate, the most powerful churchman in the land, and the captured king's own brother. The bells rang for her. The clergy came out in procession. The men who held back, who had waited to see which way the war would fall, now came forward to make their peace with the woman who held the king in chains and the church at her side. For a few weeks that spring she was, to all appearances, the ruler of England in everything but the final crowning petitioned, obeyed, treated as the fount of grace and land and office. She granted, she confirmed, she heard pleas. The unprecedented thing, the thing no one had been able to imagine, seemed to be quietly becoming real before their eyes. A woman holding the government of England in her own two hands. It had taken her father's oath, 6 years of war, and a king captured in open battle to bring her to this. She had only to keep her footing for a few weeks more, and the crown itself would follow. She did not keep it, but for those weeks, she had it. And we should not let her later fall erase how near she stood to winning the whole of it. The title they gave her in that moment, Lady of the English, Domina Anglorum, repays a moment's thought, because its very awkwardness tells the whole story. It was not queen. The word queen, Regina, meant in that age the wife of a king, and to call her that would have said nothing of her right to rule in her own person. But there was no settled word for what she actually was. A woman who held the government of the realm, not through a husband, but by her own inheritance and the realm's own oath. The age had no vocabulary for it, because the age had never needed one. The thing had never happened. So they reached for a careful, in-between phrase, Lady of the English, to mark the stage she had reached, acknowledged, accepted, the fount of authority, but not yet crowned, not yet anointed, not yet made sovereign in the full and sacred sense that the crowning alone could confer. It was a title invented to describe a thing that had no name, and the fact that it had to be invented is the measure of how far into uncharted country she had come. No woman had stood there before. She stood there now, a single ceremony away from the crown itself, and the strangeness of her title was the strangeness of the whole unprecedented moment. Why she lost it is the most painful and the most argued passage of her entire life. And it deserves to be told with care, because the easy version of it is deeply unfair to her, and the unfair version is precisely the one that stuck to her name for 800 years. The chroniclers who wrote about these few weeks were, almost to a man, hostile to her, and when they came to explain her fall, they reached for the only language their age kept ready for a woman who held power and dared to use it. They called her proud, harsh, overbearing, unwomanly. They said she sat too high, spoke too sharply, refused petitions she ought to have granted, drove away the very men she most needed at her side. Some grain of it may have been true. She was proud, she had been an empress, and she did not see why she ought to beg and flatter men who owed her their allegiance by a sworn oath upon the relics of the saints. But strip away the loaded language written by men appalled to watch a woman behave like a sovereign, and what you find underneath it is a ruler in a very nearly impossible position, trying to accomplish in a handful of weeks what kings were given years to consolidate, surrounded on all sides by men hunting for any excuse to abandon her, and making, under that crushing pressure. One critical misjudgment about the City of London. London was the key to the crown, and London had to be won, not merely entered and occupied. The city was rich, proud, and long accustomed to being courted by those who wanted something from it. Its citizens had backed Stephen early and warmly, and they had real reasons to dread an Angevin victory. Their trade, their old loyalties, and the formidable presence of Stephen's queen, the other Matilda, Countess of Boulogne, who was rallying men and money for her captured husband in the rich lands just around the city. When the Empress came up to London in the summer of 1141 to prepare for her coronation, she came as a conqueror into a city that had not chosen her. And what the moment demanded of her was a patience and an open-handed generosity that both her position and her temperament made very hard to summon. The Londoners came to her with their asks: confirmation of their ancient liberties, relief from the heavy financial demands she was making to fund the final securing of her reign. By the hostile accounts, she refused them with a sharpness that turned wary, biddable subjects into open enemies overnight. By a fairer reading, she was a ruler desperately short of both money and time, besieged by petitioners on every side, struggling to hold a fragile coalition together with promises she could not pay for, and simply unable to give the city what it wanted, because she did not have it in her hand to give. The truth is most likely some hard mixture of both. What is beyond dispute is the result. London in the 12th century was not quite like anywhere else in England, and a ruler who failed to understand that failed badly. It was a city of perhaps some tens of thousands, vast by the standards of the country, walled and proud and conscious of its own weight, governed by its own men and accustomed to being bargained with rather than commanded. Its wealth came from trade, and its trade depended on order and on the goodwill of whoever held power, so its citizens watched the wars of the great with a careful, calculating eye, backing the side that best protected their interests and turning on any ruler who threatened them. They had backed Stephen, who had courted them and confirmed their privileges. They had no love for the Angevin cause and real fear of what an Angevin victory might cost their trade. When the Empress came among them, demanding money and offering little in return, hard-pressed and short of time, and unwilling to flatter men, she felt owed her their obedience. She misread the one city she could least afford to misread. London did not have to love her. It only had to not rise against her for a few more days. And instead, prodded by Stephen's queen and by its own fears and by the sharpness of a ruler who would not bend, it rose and rang its bells and drove her out, and with her the crown. On the very eve of her coronation, with the crown all but resting on her head, London rose against her. The bells of the city pealed out across the rooftops, not in celebration, but as an alarm, a summons to arms ringing the citizens out of their houses. They poured into the narrow streets in their thousands, snatching up whatever weapons came to hand, and surged toward the place where the Empress and her household sat, preparing to feast in the confidence of imminent victory. Stephen's queen and her forces were close at hand outside the walls to fan the flames. Matilda and her people had only moments. They got to horse and rode, abandoning the feast on the tables, abandoning the coronation that was a day away, abandoning the city itself, fleeing out ahead of the gathering mob with barely the time to clear the gates. It was a catastrophe wholly out of proportion to anything that had caused it. She had been within a day, perhaps within hours, of being crowned the first queen regnant in the history of England, and instead she was riding hard out of London with a roaring city at her back, and the great moment of her life turned to ash in her mouth. She never came so close to the crown again. Everything that followed, the whole remainder of her struggle, was the slow descent from that one summer evening when the bells of London rang her out of her reign. There is something almost unbearable in the timing of it. To have come so far, across 16 years of exile and return, through a broken oath and 6 years of war, through the capture of a king in open battle, and the winning of the church to stand within a single day of the crown, the feast laid, the ceremony prepared, the thing she had given her life, to finally within reach of her hand. And then, the bells. Not the joyous peal of a coronation, but the hard clamour of alarm, the city turning on her in an afternoon, the mob in the streets, the desperate scramble to horse, the flight through the gates with the feast abandoned on the tables behind her. She had been a queen in all but the crowning for a few weeks of that spring and summer. She would never be so again. Everything after London was decline, however bravely she fought it, the slow unwinding of a cause that had reached its peak and broken. She must have known it, riding out of the city that day. The greatest chance of her life had come, and she had not been able to hold it, and it would not come again. Whatever her faults in those weeks, real or invented by hostile pens, no one who has felt the weight of a thing slipping away at the last moment can read of that ride out of London without something tightening in the chest. The disasters now came on in a rush, and the next of them broke the back of her cause for good. With her coalition reeling from the loss of London, her enemies regrouped and pressed her hard, and the fighting moved that late summer to Winchester. There her forces found themselves not the besiegers, but the besieged trapped within the city, as Stephen's queen and the Londoners and the turncoat bishop closed a ring around them and drew it tight. The position grew untenable, food and hope both running short. And Matilda's people resolved at last on a desperate breakout, a fighting retreat westward out of the trap, every man for the cause and for his own life. And in the chaos and slaughter of that rout, the single worst thing that could have happened. Robert of Gloucester, her half-brother, her general, her anchor, the one wholly indispensable man, fought a rearguard action to cover the Empress's escape, holding the pursuers back while she got clear, and in doing so he was cut off, surrounded, and captured. Matilda got away. Robert did not. And now the wheel of the war had turned full circle in the cruelest way imaginable. She held the king, and her enemies held her brother. And the two most valuable prisoners in all of England stood on opposite sides of a ruined and exhausted land. The rout at Winchester was a mirror image of Lincoln, and a cruel one. At Lincoln, her side had won and taken the king. At Winchester, her side was trapped and broken, and it was her own forces who had to cut their way out through an enemy closing around them. The fighting in the streets and on the roads out of the city was a chaos of flight and pursuit. Men cut down as they ran. The order of an army dissolving into the panic of every man for himself. Somewhere in that chaos the decision was made that mattered most, that Robert would hold the rear, would turn and fight to buy the Empress time to get clear. It was the right decision, and it cost them everything they had won. She rode hard and got away to safety. He stood and fought and was taken, and the prize of Lincoln had to be given back to buy him out of his chains. In the space of a single summer, she had gone from holding the king and the threshold of the crown to holding nothing. Her coalition shattered, her brother captured, her great chance spent. The wheel had turned all the way round, and it had ground her cause beneath it as it went. There was only one thing that could be done, and the fact that she did it tells you everything about how completely she depended on Robert. She traded the king for her brother. Stephen, the captured sovereign, the prize won in the field at Lincoln, the man whose imprisonment had carried her to within a single day of the throne, was exchanged, one prisoner for the other, for Robert of Gloucester. In the cold arithmetic of the war, it was very nearly an open admission of defeat, because it put her chief enemy back upon his throne, and at liberty to fight her again. But she had no choice in it at all. Without Robert, her cause could not so much as function. He was its sword and its spine and its steady head, and a cause cannot fight on with its heart in an enemy prison. So King was swapped for Earl. Stephen walked free. Robert came back to her side, and the war, which had so very nearly ended in her coronation that summer, instead settled back down into the weary, inconclusive deadlock it had been before. Except that now Stephen was a crowned king, restored to his liberty, and his rival was a claimant who had reached out and closed her hand on the crown and then watched it slip away. The great chance was gone, and both of them knew it. The realm sank back into its misery, the castles to their cruelty, the two sides to their grinding war across a wasted land. The exchange of prisoners has a terrible symmetry to it that the chroniclers did not miss. She had taken the king at Lincoln and stood at the threshold of the throne. She lost her brother at Winchester and was thrown back from it. King for Earl, the two great captures of the war cancelling each other out, and the board swept clean back to where it had stood before, except that the moment was gone and would not return. It is the kind of bitter arithmetic that war forces on those who wage it. To keep Stephen was to keep the prize and lose the man who alone could make the prize good. To free Stephen was to give back everything won at Lincoln in order to recover the one indispensable ally. There was no good choice, only the necessary one, and she made it without flinching, because she understood better than anyone that a cause without Robert at its head was no cause at all. So she handed back the king she had bled to capture, and took back her brother, and the two of them set about the weary work of fighting on a war that neither side could now win, and neither side would yield. And it is here, in the lowest stretch of her fortunes, in the months after she had held the crown in her own hand, and watched it slip away after the rout at Winchester, after the loss and the costly buying back of her brother, that the single most famous moment of her whole life took place. It is the moment that, more than the imperial title, or the war, or the broken oath, fixed her forever in memory. It happened at Oxford, in the dead of winter, and it is the kind of scene that sounds like something a storyteller invented, and is not. It is set down by the chroniclers of her own hostile age, men with no reason to flatter her, who could not help, even so, admiring the sheer nerve of it. In the closing months of 1142, Matilda was at Oxford, lodged in the castle there, when Stephen moved against her with a sudden speed and decision, far more decision than he usually showed, as though he sensed at last that his rival might be taken once and for all, and the agony ended. He fell upon the town, forced the crossing of the river, drove her men back inside the castle walls, and settled down to a siege. And this was nothing like the loose, half-gentlemanly investment of Arundel 3 years before, the one he had let her walk away from. This was a tight, determined, closely drawn siege, the lines ringing the castle near, the king's men dug in and patient, settling in to starve the place out as the winter came down hard around them. Matilda was trapped, with a shrinking garrison and a dwindling store of food, while the weeks dragged on toward Christmas and the weather turned to iron. Stephen had learned his lesson at Arundel. He meant to have her this time. The siege held through the deepening cold, the supplies behind the walls sank lower and lower, and it became plain to everyone inside that the castle could not hold out much longer. Capture was now a matter of days. The whole cause was about to end here, in a freezing castle on the upper Thames, with the Empress in the king's hands, and not one man left at liberty with the strength to fight on for her right. To understand the desperation of the thing she was about to do, you have to feel the closing of the trap. A castle under siege in the 12th century did not fall to a single assault, as a rule. It fell to hunger and time. The besiegers ringed it, cut its supply, and waited. And inside the walls, the defenders watched their stores dwindle and counted the days. At Oxford, the days had nearly run out. The bread was going, the cold was a weapon as cruel as any the king's men carried. For there was little fuel and a hard winter pressing on the stone. Every road out was watched, every gate was guarded. The river that might have offered a way was frozen solid and lay open to the eyes of the sentries by day. And beyond the walls sat Stephen himself, patient at last, determined this time to make no chivalrous gesture, to let no safe conduct carry his rival away as he had at Arundel. He had only to wait a few more days, and the greatest prize of the whole war would simply fall into his hands, the Empress herself, and the cause would be over. Matilda, inside, knew all of this as well as he did. She knew that surrender meant the end, and that there was no army left in the field strong enough to break the siege from outside. If she was to get out, she would have to get herself out, and there was almost no way left to do it. Almost, so she chose the one road that no besieger on earth would think to set a guard upon. The country lay buried under deep snow. The river had frozen hard from bank to bank. The nights were long and black and bitter, and on one such night Matilda had herself and 3 or 4 companions dressed from head to foot, entirely in white cloaks, thrown over everything, white against the white of the snow. And they were let down out of the castle into the freezing dark. By one account they went out through a small postern gate. By another, they were lowered on ropes down the cold stone of the walls. And then they simply walked. They walked out through Stephen's own siege lines, past his sentries and his watchfires, 4 or 5 hooded figures in white, moving across a white and frozen landscape where the straining eye could find nothing to catch hold of. The fresh snow swallowing the sound of their steps, the cold so deep it must have burned in the lungs at every breath. They crossed the frozen Thames on foot, the river ice bearing their weight in the dark, and then they went on foot through the killing cold, mile after mile, across the snow-covered country in the dead of a winter night, until at last they reached safety, first at Abingdon and then at Wallingford, where her own men held the walls. She had walked out of a tightening trap, straight through the middle of an enemy army, across a frozen river, in the dark, in the snow, dressed in white, so that the watching eyes slid over her, and she had not been seen. It is one of the most famous escapes in all of English history, and the most remarkable thing about it is that it is simply true. There is a detail in the accounts that is almost too perfect, and yet the chroniclers, who had no reason to flatter her, set it down in earnest. That the white cloaks were chosen precisely because the country lay under snow, so the figures in white would melt into a white landscape and the watching eyes find nothing to fix on. It is the kind of cool, practical cleverness that wins through where mere courage would fail, not a desperate dash, but a calculated disappearance, a use of the very weather that was helping to starve her out. Someone thought of it, planned it, found the white cloaks, chose the blackest night, timed the descent from the walls. Whether the thought was Matilda's own or a loyal companion's we cannot know, but the nerve to carry it out was certainly hers. For she was the one whose capture would end everything, and she was the one who had to walk slowest and steadiest through the lines. The escape from Oxford is remembered as a feat of daring, and it was. But it was also a feat of cold intelligence, of turning a hopeless position inside out by seeing the one gap no one was guarding, and that, even more than the daring, is the mark of the ruler she had been trained from childhood to be. Stay with what that night must have asked of her, because it is the truest window we have into the woman. Underneath the hostile word, the chroniclers hung on her. The cold alone would have broken most people, the wet snow soaking through. The wind coming off the open river, the hours of walking with no fire and no shelter and no certainty whatever of safety at the far end of it. The fear of it, the knowledge that a single shout from a sentry, a single line of fresh tracks noticed in the snow, a single dog barking at a shadow, meant capture, and capture meant the end of everything she had given her life to. And then the sheer composure, the thing required to walk, not run, to move slowly and evenly through the lines of an army that wanted her above all prizes, trusting the white cloaks and the dark and the falling snow to hide her, putting one foot down after another, mile upon frozen mile, without panic, without a sound. This was the woman they called proud and harsh and unwomanly. On that night, her famous pride showed itself as something else entirely, as courage of a very high and rare order, the flat refusal to give in, even with the walls closing and the food gone, and the king himself camped at the gate. She came out of Oxford with nothing left to her but her own life and her cause still somehow breathing. And in the end, her life and her cause were enough, because she had a son, and the son was growing toward his strength. Wallingford, where she came to rest after that night, was one of the great loyal fortresses of her cause, held for her through everything by a faithful castellan, and reaching it meant safety at last. But picture the arrival, an empress on foot, half frozen, having walked miles through snow in the dark, out of a besieged castle, coming at last to a friendly gate in the grey of a winter dawn. There would have been fire and food and dry clothes, and the deep animal relief of having simply lived through it. And underneath the relief there would surely have been the colder knowledge that she had escaped with nothing but her life, that Oxford was lost behind her, that she had walked out of one trap only to walk back into the same losing war she had been fighting for years. The escape across the snow was magnificent, and it was also, in the larger story, the measure of how far she had fallen, from the threshold of the crown the summer before, to a fugitive crossing, a frozen river by night, to keep out of an enemy's hands. That she could do it at all, that she had the nerve and the hardness to bring it off, is precisely why her cause did not collapse that winter. She would not be caught, and she would not quit, and so the war ground on. And the son grew toward his strength, and in the end, that flat refusal to be finished proved worth more than the crown she had lost. What came after the snow was not triumph and not defeat, but something harder to bear than either. Years of it. The escape from Oxford had kept her cause alive, and keeping it alive turned out to be the whole of what the next stretch of her life amounted to. She settled in the West, in the country that held for her, Gloucester, Bristol, Devizes, the strongholds along the Severn and the Western roads, and there she made what was in effect a second England. A rival government with its own court and its own grants and its own coinage, set against Stephen's England in the south and east. The country was divided down the middle, not cleanly, but in a ragged, shifting line of loyalties, and along that line the war went on without ever resolving. Neither side could land the blow that finished the other. Stephen could not take the West. Matilda could not take the crown. So they ground against each other, year after year, and the people in between paid for it, as they always did. You can see the division in the very coins of those years, which is a small thing that tells a large one. In a settled kingdom, there was one coinage, struck in the king's name, carrying the king's face and the king's authority into every market and every purse in the land. Money itself was a statement of who ruled. In the divided England of the war, that unity broke apart like everything else. Coins were struck in Matilda's name, and in the names of her partisans as well as in Stephen's. Some great lords, holding their own corners of the country by their own swords, struck money in their own names as though they were petty kings, which, in the chaos they very nearly were. A person handling the coins of those years held the fracture of the realm in the palm of the hand competing faces, competing claims, the plain currency of daily life turned into one more battlefield. It is the kind of detail that brings the abstraction of a divided kingdom down to something you can picture. Not only armies and sieges, but the very pennies changing hands in a village market, no longer agreeing on who was king. Picture the texture of those years for her, because it is a particular kind of endurance that does not make for famous stories and is harder than the famous stories suggest. There were no more near coronations, no captured kings, no escapes across frozen rivers. Only the daily, unglamorous work of holding a cause together when the great chance has already come and gone. She held court in her western strongholds. She issued charters in the style of a sovereign, granting lands and confirming privileges, keeping alive the legal fact of her right, even when the military fact of it was stalled. She kept her party's lords in some kind of order, settled their quarrels, found the money to pay their men, and gave them a centre to gather around so that the cause did not simply dissolve into a scatter of private wars. It was administration as much as warfare, and it was relentless, and it went on for years, with no end in sight. The woman who did this was the same woman who had governed the empire as a girl, and the training told. She knew how to keep a government running. Now she kept one running in the corner of a country that would not have her, against a king who would not go away, for the sake of a son who was not yet grown. Devizes, in particular, became something close to a capital for her in these years. A great castle in Wiltshire, well placed and strong, which she took as a principal seat, and from which much of her cause was directed. It is worth holding the picture, not the fugitive of the Oxford snow, nor the near queen of the London summer, but a settled war leader in a western stronghold, the rooms busy with clerks and messengers, the courtyard loud with the comings and goings of armed men. The business of a rival realm transacted day by day within the walls. Here the charters were drawn and sealed. Here the lords of her party came to take her counsel and her commands. Here the long defiance had its centre. It was a smaller world than the empire she had governed, or the England she had nearly won, but it was hers, and she ran it with the same gravity she brought to everything, and from it she kept her son's inheritance alive through years when a lesser will would have let it slip. The grandeur of her youth had narrowed to this: a castle on a Wiltshire hill, a divided country, a waiting game. She played it to the end without flinching, and the son was the point of all of it now. The thing the whole weary holding action was for. Across these years, young Henry was growing toward his strength on the continent and beginning to come into England himself, a boy first, then a youth, then a young man plainly marked for greatness, crossing the channel to show himself to his mother's party and to learn the country he meant to claim. In the year 1147, at about 14 years of age, he crossed the channel on his own initiative with a small hired band of soldiers, meaning to fight for his mother's cause. And the venture collapsed almost at once when the money ran out and he could not pay his men. What happened next is one of the strangest and most telling episodes of the whole war. He appealed first to his mother for funds, and she refused him. He turned to his uncle Robert of Gloucester, and Robert refused him too, for both of them disapproved of the reckless little expedition. So the boy, with the impudence of his age, appealed to the one man left King Stephen himself, the very man whose throne he had come to take, and Stephen, with the careless generosity that ran all through his character, quietly paid off the young invader's mercenaries and sent him safely home to Normandy. It is an extraordinary thing to have done to one's own rival's son, and it says as much about Stephen as Lincoln did. But beneath the strangeness, the meaning is plain. The war was passing, year by year, from the mother who could not win it to the son who one day would. Matilda's task in these middle years was simply to keep the door open until he was ready to walk through it. She did. That was the achievement of the deadlock years, not victory, which was beyond her, but the patient refusal to let the cause die before her son could inherit it. For that, in plain truth, is how the war was finally won, not by Matilda ever seizing the crown, which, after that night at Oxford, she must have known in her heart she would never now do herself, but by her holding the cause together, by will and by nerve, long enough to hand it on whole to the next generation. The fighting ground on for years more, a weary stalemate that neither side had the strength left to break. The country exhausted past bearing, the chance long gone. And then, in the autumn of 1147, the blow fell that ended Matilda's own active part in the struggle for good. Robert of Gloucester died, her half-brother, her general, her anchor, the one man whose loyalty had never failed her across the whole length of the war. He died not in battle, but of illness, worn out at last by the years of fighting his sister's fight. With Robert gone, the heart simply went out of the war for Matilda. The coalition that he, far more than she, had held together began to come apart at the seams. There was no longer any realistic road to the throne for her in her own person. And so, the following year, in 1148, the Empress did the hardest and wisest act of her whole life. She left England, she crossed the Channel for the last time, withdrew into Normandy, and handed the cause to her son. Robert's death in 1147 deserves to be felt and not merely noted because of all the losses of her life. It was perhaps the heaviest. He had been her champion from the first, the man who turned her right into an army, who carried her cause on his own shoulders through every reverse, who had gone into captivity for her and come out still loyal. For something close to a decade, he had been the one fixed point in a shifting and treacherous world. The brother who did not waver when so many wavered, and then he was simply gone, worn out in her service, dead of illness rather than the sword, which somehow made it worse. Not the clean end of a soldier in battle, but the slow using up of a good man in a cause that could not be won. With him went the last real chance of the older generation. She must have known, standing at the edge of that loss, that her own active war was over, that without Robert she could not hold the field, that what remained to her now was not to win the crown, but to pass the claim on intact. It was grief, and it was a turning point at once. The brother was buried, the cause went to the son, and the Empress, for the first time in many years, was truly alone at the head of a thing that had always, until now, had Robert standing beside her. There is a temptation, looking back, to call her a failure, the heir who was never crowned, the claimant who reached for the throne and missed. It is the wrong word entirely. Measure her not against the crown she did not wear, but against the situation she was actually handed, and the achievement is plain. She was a woman in an age that held women could not rule, asserting a claim no woman had ever made good, against a crowned and anointed king with the treasury and much of the country behind him. In a war she could not win by arms because the barons would not finally follow a woman into the field. By any cold reckoning she should have lost completely, been captured early, ended her days a prisoner or an exile while Stephen's line ruled on. Instead, she fought the most powerful man in England to a standstill for the better part of 2 decades, came within a day of the crown, escaped every trap set for her, and handed her claim on so intact that her son took the throne in peace and founded a dynasty. She did not get the thing she wanted most. She got something arguably larger. She changed the succession of England by force of will against every disadvantage her age could pile on her, and her blood has sat on the throne ever since. Call that a failure, and the word loses all meaning. She withdrew, but she did not surrender, and this is the part of her story that the legend of the proud, beaten woman always leaves out. She had simply changed the field of battle. The boy born at Le Mans in 1133 was now a young man of fierce and obvious ability. Henry, her son, soon to be Henry II, and the claim she could no longer press in her own body, she now advanced through his. From Normandy she governed and counselled and held the whole tangle of the family's interests together on the continent, while her son grew into his full strength and took up the war in England in his own name. And he succeeded where she had been blocked at every turn. For the simplest of reasons, he had the one advantage she could never have. He was a man, a young, vigorous, lawful male heir of the old king's blood, in whom the right of Matilda's line and the sex the barons demanded were joined together at last in a single person. The great men who could not bring themselves to kneel to a queen could readily picture themselves following a king. Henry pressed Stephen hard, year after year, and at the last, worn down, his own son and heir dead before him, his will to fight on broken, Stephen came to terms. By the treaty made at Winchester in 1153, Stephen would keep his crown for the remainder of his life, but on his death it would pass not to his own line, but to Matilda's son, Henry. The very next year Stephen died, and Henry came to the throne as Henry II of England, the first of the long line of Plantagenet kings. Everything Matilda had fought for, everything the broken oath had stolen from her, came true at last, not in her own person, but in her son, which to a woman of her age and her world was the same victory by another door. She herself was never crowned, but she had made a king, and the king was hers. Geoffrey, meanwhile, had not been idle on the continent, and his work there mattered more to the final outcome than the English chroniclers, fixed on the war in England, tended to notice. While Matilda fought for the crown in England, her husband fought for the duchy in Normandy, and there he succeeded where she was blocked. Year by year he reduced the Norman strongholds, won over or beat down the barons, and made himself master of the duchy in the right of his wife and his son. By the end of the 1140s, Normandy was effectively theirs, and that conquest was no small thing. It meant that when their son Henry came of age, he inherited not merely a claim to England, but the solid reality of Normandy, the heartland of the dynasty, a base of real power from which to press the English war. The partnership that had begun so badly, the proud Empress and the boy Count, had become in the end a remarkably effective division of labour. She held the claim and the cause and the years of defiance in England. He won the duchy in France, and between them they built for their son the foundation of an empire. They were never, by any account, fond of one another, but they were, in the work that finally counted, formidable allies, and their son reaped what their unhappy marriage had sown. Watch the son take up what the mother laid down, because it is the quiet vindication of her whole fight. Henry came into England in his own right, a young man now, hard and quick and sure of himself, and he carried the same claim his mother had carried. But he carried it as a man, and the doors that had stayed shut against her swung open for him. He had her blood and her right, and the old king's blood, through her, and he had the one quality the barons had demanded all along and she could never supply, where she had been told a woman could not rule. He was simply a king in waiting, and men who had refused his mother flocked to him. It must have been a complicated thing for her to watch from Normandy, to see the cause she had bled for prosper in his hands, precisely because he was what she was not, to know that her right had been good all along, and that only her sex had stood between her and the throne. But if there was bitterness in it, there was triumph too, and the triumph was the larger part. She had kept the claim alive through the worst years, through London and Winchester and the snow at Oxford. Kept it alive by sheer will when wiser heads would have let it die, and now she was handing it on intact to a son who could finish what she had begun. That was her victory, and she had earned every hard inch of it. The treaty that ended it all, made at Winchester in 1153, was in its way a quiet masterpiece, and it gave Matilda everything that finally mattered. Stephen was worn down, and his heart had gone out of the fight. His elder son and intended heir had died, and a man fighting for a future that has died with his son fights with half a soul. So the terms were settled. Stephen would keep the crown and reign in peace for the rest of his days. The war was over. The country could begin at last to heal. But he adopted Henry as his heir, setting aside his own surviving son's claim, so that on Stephen's death the throne would pass to Matilda's line and to no other. It was the cause she had fought 18 years for, won at the last by negotiation where it could not be won by the sword. She had not taken the crown. Her son would inherit it lawfully and in peace, with the agreement of the very man who had stolen it from her, which was in some ways a cleaner victory than conquest could ever have been. The next year Stephen died, worn out, and Henry crossed to England and was crowned without a single hand raised against him. The war was over at last. The broken oath was made good at last, not in the person it had named, but in her son, which she had long since decided was more than enough. She lived on for many years after that, in Normandy, in and around Rouen, and these last years were among the most settled and, in their quiet way, among the most influential of her whole life. She did not fade gently into a forgotten widowhood. She remained the mother of the King of England and Duke of Normandy, and her son valued her counsel and her hard-won experience to the very end of her days. She acted as his representative in Normandy, mediated his disputes, advised him through the great quarrels of his stormy reign, and remained a figure of real weight and consequence on the continent, long after the English crown itself had passed forever beyond her own reach. There is a famous story, perhaps true, perhaps the kind of shrewd thing a later age likes to put into the mouth of an old and formidable ruler, that when her son asked her how he ought to handle his unruly and grasping subjects, she told him to manage them as a man manages an unruly hawk. Offer the meat, and then snatch it away again, so that the creature stays forever hungry and forever eager and never quite satisfied enough to turn on the hand that feeds it. Whether or not she ever truly said it, the saying has the exact flavour of the woman shrewd, hard, bottomlessly versed in the management of power and men, a ruler to the very marrow of her bones, even when the ruling was being done through another. Rouen in these years suited her. It was a great and ancient city on the Seine, the chief seat of the Dukes of Normandy, rich with churches and trade, and the long memory of her own family's power. For it was from Normandy that her great-grandfather had set out to conquer England, and to Normandy that her father had returned again and again to govern the heartland of the dynasty. Here she was not a stranger, asking hard men to accept the unacceptable, as she had been in England. Here she was the Duke's mother and a figure of settled, unquestioned authority, in a land that knew her and her blood, and bent to it without the resentment England had shown. She kept a household, received petitioners and envoys, gave judgments, managed estates and revenues, and watched over her son's interests on the continent with the same close attention to the working of power that she had first learned as a girl in Germany half a century before. The fire that had carried her across a frozen river had not gone out. It had only found a place to burn steadily at last, in a city that let her be what she had always known herself to be. A ruler, in fact, if not in name, to the very end. It is worth saying that piety, in her world, was not a retreat from power, but a part of it. The great religious houses were among the most important institutions of the age, and to endow them was to shape the spiritual and intellectual life of a country, to win the prayers that were believed to ease the soul's passage, and to leave a mark that would outlast any fortress of stone. When Matilda gave generously to the abbeys around Rouen in her last years, she was doing what serious rulers did, securing her memory, ordering her legacy, attending to the one realm whose claims even an empress could not ignore. She had spent her active life in the management of earthly power, and she brought the same gravity to the management of her standing before God. There is no reason to doubt the piety. The people of that age believed what they professed, and an old woman who had buried her father, 2 husbands, her loyal brother, and the cousin who had wronged her, had every reason to turn her mind toward the end of things. But it was also, like nearly everything she did, the act of a ruler putting her affairs in order, and the order she sought was the deep, deliberate order of someone who had always understood power, and who meant to keep her grip on her own destiny, even at the gates of the next world. She gave her last years, too, increasingly, to the things that had always run quietly alongside the politics of her life, to the church, to religious foundations, to acts of piety and patronage. She had been crowned in the imperial style as a girl of 15 near the heart of Rome. She had governed an empire and a duchy. She had walked across a frozen river in the snow in the dark to keep her cause alive. She had made a king of her son. Now, in her last years, she turned toward her soul and toward her legacy, endowing religious houses, giving generously to the great abbeys around Rouen, preparing herself in the manner of her age for the end she knew was coming. And through every changing season of that long life, the one title she clung to, the one she required to the very last, was not Queen, which she never was, and not even Lady of the English, which she had briefly and so painfully been. It was Empress. She had herself called Empress to the end of her days, and it is the word that stands on her tomb. She had been the consort of the Lord of the Western world, crowned at the summit of Christendom while she was still a girl, and that, in her own unshakable reckoning, outranked every honour England had dangled before her and then snatched away. The Abbey of Bec, where she chose to be buried, was no accident of geography, but a love of long standing. Bec was one of the foremost houses of learning in all of Normandy, a place that had produced archbishops of Canterbury and scholars known across Christendom, a centre of the intellectual life of the Norman Church. Matilda gave to it generously across her last years, as she gave to other religious houses, endowing, building, securing prayers for her soul in the manner that the great of her age understood as the truest investment a person could make against eternity. There is something fitting in her choosing Bec to lie in, not a royal mausoleum, not Westminster where she was never crowned, not the imperial cities of her youth, but a Norman house of learning in the heartland of her family's power. Close to the sun she had made a king. She had been carried from place to place her whole life. England to Germany to Italy, to Anjou to England again, and back to Normandy, never quite belonging anywhere. An empress in England and an English heiress in the empire, at home fully in neither. At Bec, at the last, she came to rest, and the inscription they set over her gathered the whole restless journey into 3 words: daughter, wife, mother of a king, of an emperor, of a king. The Empress Matilda died in the autumn of the year 1167, near Rouen, an old woman by the hard measure of her age, having outlived very nearly everyone who had shaped her long and violent century. Her father, the old king, both of her husbands, the cousin who had stolen her crown, the half-brother who had carried her cause on his own shoulders for so many years. She was buried at the Abbey of Bec. the great Norman house she had loved and richly endowed, and over her grave there was set an inscription that has rung down the centuries as the truest single summary of her ever written. It said in effect that here lay Matilda, great by her birth, greater by her marriage, but greatest of all by her motherhood. Daughter of a king, wife of an emperor, mother of a king, daughter, wife, and mother of the powerful. And yet, the epitaph means us to understand, a force entirely in her own right, a woman who had bent the whole history of two countries around the shape of her will. She had never worn the English crown, but the line of kings who would rule England for the next 300 years and more ran through her body and through no other. The Plantagenets were her descendants, every one. And every English monarch from that day to this descends, in the end, from the Empress who was never queen. Her son was at the height of his extraordinary power when she died, master of an empire of his own that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, the greatest ruler in Western Europe. He had quarrels enough in his life with his archbishop, with his sons, with his formidable wife, but with his mother. By every sign, he kept faith to the end, valuing her counsel, trusting her with Normandy, mourning her when she was gone. She had given him his claim and held it for him through the worst years and handed it on whole. And he had made of it a dominion vaster than anything her father or her first husband had ruled. In that sense, her life's work did not end at her grave at Bec. It went on in him, and in his sons after him, and down through the long line of English kings, who all, in the end, traced their right back through her. Few people, in any age, get to see their life's purpose so completely fulfilled, even at one remove. She had been told a woman could not rule, and she had answered, across 40 years and 2 countries, by making certain that her blood would rule for centuries. The crown she never wore sat on the heads of her descendants for longer than the memory of why she had been denied it. It is strange to reflect that almost no one walking the streets of any English town today could tell you her name, and yet almost all of them, if their families go back far enough on this island, carry some thread of her legacy in the country they live in its line of kings, its laws shaped by her son, its very sense that the crown passes by lawful inheritance and not by whoever can seize it fastest. She lost her own war for the throne and won the larger argument that right sworn and inherited mattered, and that an usurpation, however successful in the moment, carried a flaw that time would expose. Her son took the crown as the lawful heir by a treaty that affirmed inheritance over seizure, and that principle outlived them both. She is one of those figures whose defeat was more fruitful than most victories, who did not get what she wanted, and got, instead, something that lasted. The crown that was denied her in London in 1141 has descended in an unbroken line of argument, if not always of blood, through every reign since. She was never queen. She is the reason the queens and kings who came after could be sure of what they were. And so we come to the end of her long life, and to the quiet that ought to come at the end of any life, lived as fully as that one was. Let your mind rest now on the last image of her. An old woman in Normandy, the wars all long behind her, the snow and the sieges and the broken oath and the bells of London, all settled at last into memory, sitting in the calm of her final years near the river at Rouen. The most powerful king in Europe coming to her chamber for counsel, the proud title she had earned as a girl of 15 still hers, and hers alone. She had been carried over the sea as a child of 8 to be made into something useful to a dynasty. She had been made instead into something far greater and far stranger than anyone had ever planned. Empress, claimant, fugitive in the snow, kingmaker. The living knot that tied the two Englands together, the woman who came within the ringing of a single set of bells of a crown no woman had ever worn, and who denied it. simply set her will to making certain that her son would wear it in her place. The fields she had fought across grew green and quiet again. The lawless castles came down or were tamed. The broken countries slowly healed, and the line she carried in her body went on and on down all the centuries. To us. So let the centuries settle into quiet around her. The armies that crossed and recrossed the broken country have since disbanded. The men who swore the oath and broke it are dust. The cousins who fought their war for the crown are both at rest, the one in his grave and the other soon to join him. The castles that scarred the land are coming down. The fields are being sown again, the mills turning, the roads safe enough once more for ordinary people to walk them without listening for hoofbeats. And in a quiet chamber near the Seine, an old woman sits among her books and her foundations and her memories, but the proud title of her girlhood still on her lips. The son she made a king ruling an empire of his own from the Scottish border to the mountains of the south. She has outlived nearly everyone. She has been carried across the sea twice, crowned near Rome, denied a crown in London, hunted across the snow, and she has come at last to stillness in the land of her family's beginning. There is nothing left to fight for, and no more ground to lose. The striving is over, and what remains is rest, the deep, earned rest of someone who gave everything she had to a thing larger than herself, and in the end, and against every odds, did not fail at it. If these long evenings spent inside another time are something you would like to find your way back to, you are always welcome to subscribe, and the next one will come to you when it is ready. There is no hurry in any of it, it is only somewhere quiet to go at the end of the day. Until then, sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.